beginning, there was only chaos. Not chaos in the modern sense, no noise, no confusion, but a yawning void, a blank space where time, matter, and meaning had yet to exist. From this strange emptiness, the universe began to take shape, not through scientific forces, but through stories, powerful, poetic, and deeply human stories. These are the tales the ancient Greeks told not to explain what is, but to understand why. Greek mythology is not just a collection of old legends. It is the foundation of Western storytelling, a bridge between belief and imagination, and a mirror reflecting ancient human hopes, fears, and questions. This is not just the story of Zeus and Athena or Heracles and Odysseus. It's the story of how a civilization used myth to understand power, fate, justice, and love. This is the entire story of Greek mythology. Let's begin. According to Greek mythology, before there were gods, before the earth and sky, before even the concept of time, there was only one thing: chaos. This word, chaos, did not mean disorder in the way we understand it today. To the ancient Greeks, it meant a gaping void, an empty chasm, a state of complete formlessness. Chaos was not a being, but a condition, the raw state of the universe before creation began. From this vast emptiness, the first entities emerged. They were not gods, not yet. They were primordial beings, fundamental forces of nature and existence itself. The first among them was Gaia, the earth, a self-forming, living presence that would become the great mother of all creation. Alongside her came Tartarus, a deep abyss far below the surface of Gaia, often imagined as a cosmic prison or the most distant part of the underworld. Then came Eros, the force of attraction and desire, the energy that would later bind gods and mortals in love and lineage. Also emerging from chaos were Nyx, the night, and Erebus, the darkness of the underworld. These primordial beings were not mythological in the same way Zeus or Athena would be. They were not shaped by personality, but by function. They represented the building blocks of the universe. Gaia was not just the earth, she was earth. Tartarus was not simply a place. It was the embodiment of depth and imprisonment. And Eros was not just romantic love, but the binding force that gave structure and motion to the cosmos. Gaia, in her solitude, gave birth to Uranus, the sky, who stretched over her like a canopy. Together, Gaia and Uranus would become the first true divine couple in Greek mythology. Their union was not romantic, but elemental, earth and sky joining to bring life into the world. From their union came a powerful new generation, the Titans, massive and powerful beings who would rule before the Olympian gods. There were 12 original Titans, 6 male and 6 female. Among them were Oceanus, who represented the river that encircled the world, Hyperion, associated with the sun, Thea, linked to sight and heavenly light, and Cronus, the youngest and most ambitious of them all. Gaia and Uranus also produced the Hecatonkairos, 3 giants with 100 hands and 50 heads, and the Cyclopes, one-eyed beings known for their brute strength and later their craftsmanship. But harmony did not last long in the mythic world. Uranus, perhaps fearing his children or threatened by their power, imprisoned the Hecatonkairos and the Cyclopes deep within Gaia's body. This act caused Gaia immense pain. She was not only their mother, she was their very environment, and the suffering was both physical and symbolic. Unable to bear the cruelty, Gaia devised a plan to free her children and punish Uranus. She turned to her Titan sons for help. Most were afraid to challenge their father, but Cronus, cunning and ambitious, agreed. Gaia gave him a sickle of flint, and when Uranus came to lie with her, Cronus struck. He castrated Uranus and cast his father's severed parts into the sea. This violent act ended Uranus's rule and marked the first divine succession in Greek mythology. From the blood of Uranus spilled onto the earth, more beings were born. The Erinyes, or Furies, emerged, avenging spirits of justice. So did the Gigantes, or giants, and the Meliae, ash tree nymphs. From the foam of the sea, where Uranus's severed parts landed, came Aphrodite, the goddess of love and beauty. This story ties creation not to peace, but to conflict and suffering, an enduring theme in Greek myth. With Uranus dethroned, Cronus took his place as the new ruler of the cosmos. He freed his siblings and took his sister Rhea as his consort. Under his rule, the Titans entered what the Greeks later called the Golden Age, a time of peace, prosperity, and balance. But Cronus, like his father before him, would be haunted by fear of losing power. A prophecy foretold that one of his own children would overthrow him, just as he had overthrown Uranus. To prevent this, Cronus began swallowing each of his newborn children as soon as they were born. Hestia, Demeter, Hera, Hades, and Poseidon all were consumed. But Rhea, unwilling to lose yet another child, secretly hid her youngest, Zeus, and gave Cronus a stone wrapped in cloth instead. This child would grow to fulfill the prophecy and challenge the Titans themselves. But that is a story for the next chapter. The myth of chaos and the first beings may seem abstract to modern minds, but to the ancient Greeks, it was a profound way of explaining the origins of everything. They did not separate the divine from the physical world, earth, sky, love, darkness. These were not just concepts. They were forces alive with intention and legacy. The myths provided a language to speak about existence itself. What's striking is how the Greek creation myths do not start with perfection or divine harmony. Instead, they begin with instability, fear, and rebellion. Each generation of gods struggles with the one before it. The pattern of fathers being overthrown by sons appears again and again. This reflects a deep awareness in Greek culture of the tension between old and new, order and chaos, power and vulnerability. This origin story also reflects the Greeks' view of the universe as inherently dynamic. Nothing in Greek mythology remains fixed. The gods themselves are subject to fate, and the cosmos is shaped by conflict as much as by creativity. By grounding their myths in such elemental forces, the Greeks made their stories both vast and relatable. The tale of Uranus and Cronus is not just a cosmic myth, it is also a reflection of human anxieties about authority, change, and the cycle of generations. Though these myths were passed down through oral tradition long before they were ever written, the earliest surviving sources come from authors like Hesiod. In his work, Theogony, written in the 8th century BCE, Hesiod lays out the genealogies of the gods and the structure of the cosmos. It is through works like his that we understand how the Greeks viewed the mythological past, not as distant fantasy, but as the spiritual and cultural foundation of their world. With the primordial cosmos in motion and the first divine generations emerging, the mythic world began to take shape. After chaos came Gaia, the earth, and from Gaia, Uranus, the sky. Together, they formed the first divine pair, whose union marked the beginning of structured existence. But structure in Greek mythology rarely came without conflict. As the sky enveloped the earth, Uranus became Gaia's partner and consort. Their union produced not only natural forces, but also the first gods of power and personality. From their union came the Titans, the Titanomachy, and the Cyclopes. While the Titans would become the next ruling generation, the Titanomachy, giants with 100 arms and 50 heads, and the Cyclopes, massive beings with a single eye, were seen as more monstrous and untamed. Uranus, disturbed or threatened by these children, especially the Titanomachy and the Cyclopes, imprisoned them deep within Gaia's womb. This act was not only a rejection of his offspring, but also a violent betrayal of Gaia herself. In the mythological tradition, Gaia is not passive. As Earth, she is enduring, nurturing, and responsive to injustice. Unable to endure the pain of holding her own children inside her, Gaia resolved to resist. She turned to her other children, the Titans, and pleaded for help. This was the first recorded moment in Greek myth where generational conflict became central. Most of the Titans hesitated, unwilling to confront their powerful father. But one did not. Cronus, the youngest and most cunning among them, agreed to act. Gaia crafted a great sickle from flint, a sharp tool not unlike the earliest human cutting instruments. When Uranus descended to lie with Gaia again, Cronus lay in wait. With one swift stroke, Cronus castrated Uranus, ending his reign in a moment of brutal finality. The severed parts of Uranus fell into the sea, and from the foam that gathered around them, a new being emerged, Aphrodite, the goddess of love and beauty. Uranus's downfall marked the first divine succession in Greek mythology. The act was not only violent, but also symbolic. It suggested that power, once gained, was never safe, that the cycle of rebellion would define the divine order. The gods, unlike modern religious conceptions, were not all-knowing or morally perfect. They were powerful, yes, but also flawed, vengeful, and deeply entangled in personal and generational conflicts. From the blood of Uranus that fell to earth, other beings were born. The Erinyes, also known as the Furies, were spirits of vengeance who pursued those guilty of family crimes. The giants also emerged, along with the Melia, nymphs of the ash tree. This moment in the myth reveals a critical pattern. From violence comes not only suffering, but creation. Each act of rebellion or harm spawns new forces, often ones that continue to influence or challenge future generations. Uranus did not vanish from mythology entirely after his fall, but his active role ended. He remained a sky figure, a primordial force in the background, but never again held power. In some later interpretations, Uranus became more of a concept than a character, a symbol of outdated authority removed from the cycle of divine rule. Cronus, now in power, released his fellow Titans and took his sister Rhea as his consort. Together, they became the new ruling pair. This moment marks a shift in the mythology. While Uranus and Gaia represented elemental forces, sky and earth, Cronus and Rhea marked the beginning of a divine dynasty with more human traits: jealousy, strategy, fear, and ambition. It is important to note that the myth of Uranus and Cronus likely has deep cultural roots. Scholars suggest it reflects early Greek ideas about generational power and societal transitions. In many ancient societies, including those of the Near East, father-son conflict is a recurring theme. In this way, Cronus's overthrow of Uranus mirrors myths from neighboring cultures. But the Greek version focuses strongly on the consequences of power and the instability that comes with it. Hesiod, writing in the 8th century BCE in his Theogony, is our main source for these myths. He presents them not just as fantastic tales, but as a coherent genealogy, a way of explaining how everything in the world came to be. In Hesiod's account, the violence of succession is not incidental, it is essential. It reveals a universe in which order is not granted but earned and then challenged again. The rise of Cronus was not universally celebrated. Though he freed the Titans, Cronus immediately revealed traits similar to the father he had just overthrown. Afraid of a prophecy that one of his own children would overthrow him, Cronus began swallowing his newborns at birth. This action echoes Uranus's imprisonment of his children and sets up a grim cycle that continues in the next generation. Power, once seized, is guarded with paranoia. Each of Cronus's children, Hestia, Demeter, Hera, Hades, and Poseidon, was swallowed whole, hidden away inside his body. But Rhea, devastated by the loss of her children, resolved to deceive her husband and protect her last child. This child was Zeus. Rhea gave birth to Zeus in secret and handed Cronus a stone wrapped in cloth. He swallowed it without question. Meanwhile, Zeus was hidden and raised in secret on the island of Crete, according to most traditions, until he was old enough to challenge his father. This marks the beginning of the next great cycle in Greek mythology, the war between the Olympians and the Titans, a conflict that would define the divine order for all time. In mythology, Uranus's fall is not just a story of rebellion. It is a foundational myth about the nature of authority, the vulnerability of power, and the consequences of suppressing what is natural. Uranus feared his own children and tried to silence them. Cronus did the same. Each generation of gods reacts not with trust or wisdom, but with fear and control. And in each case, it is the very act of trying to prevent rebellion that makes it inevitable. The story of Uranus is also a reflection of how the ancient Greeks thought about the past, not as a perfect golden time, but as a place of primal struggle. The first generations of gods were not paragons of order. They were complex, flawed, and subject to the same insecurities and tensions that define human life. By the time of classical Greece in the 5th century BCE, thinkers like Plato and Herodotus would begin to question and reinterpret these myths. But the tales of Uranus and Cronus remained essential. They were not only stories of the gods, they were symbolic maps of power, time, and generational change. As we leave behind the age of Uranus and enter the age of the Titans, we begin to see mythology shift from pure cosmic origins toward more structured, divine families. The gods begin to take on personalities, stories, and motives. The abstract becomes personal. The forces of the world begin to resemble us. With Uranus cast down and the Titans free, the cosmos entered a new era. Cronus, having overthrown his father, now ruled as the supreme deity. This period, later called the Golden Age by ancient poets and thinkers, was said to be a time of balance and abundance, where mortals, still primitive in form, lived in harmony with the natural world. But beneath this golden surface, deeper tensions simmered, setting the stage for another cosmic upheaval. Cronus and his sister consort Rhea reigned from Mount Othrys, a peak in central Greece associated in myth with the Titans' power. Unlike the more anthropomorphic Olympian gods who would come later, the Titans retained a primal quality. They embodied broad cosmic forces, light, time, ocean, memory, and ruled not as a tightly organized pantheon, but as a loose collection of powerful siblings, each with their own domain. The ancient Greeks believed that during Cronus's rule, the earth brought forth fruit without toil. Humans, though not yet fully developed in the mythological timeline, were thought to live without suffering, disease, or war. This idea of a prelapsarian golden age appears not only in Hesiod's works and days, written in the 8th century BCE, but also echoes in many other cultures' myths about an age of peace before the fall. In Greek tradition, the fall comes not through moral failure, but through the natural cycle of time, rebellion, and succession. Cronus himself represented time, or more specifically, the destructive and devouring aspect of time. The ancient Greek word chronos became conflated with chronos, meaning time, though this may be a later linguistic blending. Regardless, Cronus's rule was not timeless. His fear of prophecy and obsession with control mirrored the same flaws that led to Uranus's downfall. The prophecy that haunted Cronus was straightforward. One of his children would overthrow him, just as he had overthrown Uranus. In response, Cronus took drastic and disturbing action. Every time Rhea bore a child, Cronus swallowed the newborn whole. He did not kill them. He simply hid them inside himself, trapping them in a limbo of suspended existence. This act was both literal and symbolic. Cronus, as the force of time, consumed the future itself. This pattern continued until Rhea became pregnant with her 6th child. Distraught and unwilling to lose another child to her husband's paranoia, Rhea turned to Gaia and Uranus for guidance. With their help, she devised a plan. When the time came to give birth, Rhea traveled in secret to the island of Crete and delivered her son in a cave on Mount Ida. This child was Zeus. To deceive Cronus, Rhea wrapped a stone in swaddling clothes and presented it to him as the newborn. Cronus, unaware of the trick, swallowed the stone, believing the threat had been eliminated. Zeus was raised in secret, either by nymphs, the goat Amalthea, or other local guardians, depending on the version of the myth. What is consistent in every account is that Zeus survived, grew strong, and eventually learned the truth of his heritage. His upbringing away from his father's reach became essential not only for his survival but for his eventual rise as the leader of a new generation of gods. While Zeus was hidden and raised in safety, the other Titans continued to shape the cosmos. Among the most notable were Oceanus, who represented the great river that encircled the world, Hyperion, the Titan of light, Themis, goddess of divine law, and Mnemosyne, goddess of memory. These deities did not feature prominently in dramatic myths of conflict, but they laid the foundation for important cultural ideas. For example, Mnemosyne gave birth to the Muses with Zeus, linking memory to artistic inspiration. Another titan of lasting significance was Prometheus. Though not yet prominent in this early phase, Prometheus would soon emerge as a key figure in the evolving relationship between gods and mortals. His intelligence, independence, and compassion for humanity set him apart from the rest of his kin. His actions and their consequences would ultimately shift the balance between divine authority and human freedom. Meanwhile, the tension between Cronus and the fate he feared remained unresolved. As Zeus matured, he began to gather allies. The precise timeline of these events is, of course, mythological rather than historical, but the logic within the myth is clear. Cronus's actions had created enemies, both those he imprisoned and those who sympathized with their plight. According to Hesiod's Theogony and later sources, Zeus eventually confronted Cronus. With the help of Metis, a titaness known for her wisdom, Zeus tricked Cronus into drinking an emetic potion that caused him to vomit up the children he had swallowed: Hestia, Demeter, Hera, Hades, and Poseidon. Though swallowed in infancy, they emerged fully grown and ready to stand beside their brother. This moment was not the final blow, but the beginning of a larger struggle. Cronus still held power, and many of the elder titans remained loyal to him. The conflict that would soon erupt between the old and new generations is known as the Titanomachy, the War of the Titans, a cataclysmic battle that would determine the future of the cosmos. It is worth reflecting on why the mythic tradition presents Cronus's rule as a golden age, despite his cruelty. One possible explanation is that the Greeks viewed history in terms of declining ages, each era more corrupt, more complicated, more human. The Titans were powerful but distant, ruling over a simpler world. The Olympians, who would come next, were closer to human form and emotion, greater in personality but less pure in essence. At the same time, the myth of Cronus is deeply political. The fear of being overthrown, the efforts to suppress the next generation, the use of deception to seize and maintain power, these were not just mythological themes. They reflected real human concerns in Greek society, especially during times of political change or instability. In many ways, Cronus is a tragic figure, a ruler who cannot enjoy his reign because he is obsessed with its end. In classical Greek thought, time was both a blessing and a burden. It brought growth, but also decay. Cronus, as the personification of time, was thus a complex symbol, both a force of cosmic order and a destroyer of potential. His eventual defeat would not erase his legacy, but transform it. Even in defeat, Cronus did not vanish completely from myth. In some later traditions, he was imprisoned in Tartarus. In others, especially in Roman adaptations, he was softened into Saturn, a gentler agricultural deity. The story of Cronus and the Titans also reveals a broader mythological theme, that power, once gained through rebellion, is often maintained through fear. Uranus tried to suppress the Titans, and Cronus followed the same path with his children. But suppression only delays the inevitable. In mythology, as in human history, the cycle of challenge and change is never-ending. With Zeus and his siblings freed from Cronus's stomach, a new generation of gods stood ready to claim their place in the cosmos. But power was never handed over peacefully in Greek mythology. The reign of the Titans, though weakened by Cronus's fear and missteps, did not simply dissolve. Instead, it gave way to one of the most defining and dramatic conflicts in myth, the Titanomachy, a war between the old gods and the new. The Titanomachy lasted 10 years, according to Hesiod's Theogony, and marked a turning point in divine history. It was not merely a battle for territory or revenge. It was a cosmic struggle to determine the future order of the universe. On one side stood the Titans, led by Cronus and supported by many of his siblings, who sought to preserve the old rule. On the other side were the Olympians, led by Zeus and joined by his brothers and sisters, representing change, renewal, and a new hierarchy of divine authority. The war began shortly after Zeus forced Cronus to disgorge his siblings. Though Cronus had once led a rebellion against Uranus, he now found himself in the position of the threatened ruler. The Titans who sided with Cronus included Atlas, Coeus, Iapetus, and Crius, powerful beings associated with cosmic and elemental forces. However, not all Titans joined the fight. Some remained neutral, and a few even aided the Olympians. Zeus and his allies initially lacked the raw power to defeat the elder Titans. Though younger, they were fewer in number and had not yet established a secure base of operations. They made their headquarters on Mount Olympus, while the Titans held Mount Othrys. These two mountains, separated by geography but united in symbolic importance, became the mythic centers of the two opposing forces. Realizing that brute strength alone would not secure victory, Zeus turned to those who had been long imprisoned and forgotten, the Titanomachy and the Cyclopes. These monstrous beings, buried deep in the depths of Tartarus by Uranus and kept there by Cronus, had suffered injustice for generations. Zeus descended into Tartarus and freed them, an act of both strategy and principle. By rescuing the old enemies of tyranny, Zeus forged powerful alliances. The Titanomachy, each with 100 arms and incredible strength, became key figures in the war. The Cyclopes, master craftsmen, repaid Zeus by forging weapons that would shape the battle and the future of the gods. To Zeus, they gave the thunderbolt, a symbol of divine authority and overwhelming power. To Poseidon, they gave the trident, a three-pronged spear capable of shaking the earth and splitting the seas. And to Hades, they gave the helm of darkness, which allowed him to move unseen through shadows. Armed with these divine weapons and supported by formidable allies, the Olympians began to turn the tide. The war, described by Hesiod as shaking the earth, sky, and sea, was more than a clash of armies. It was a battle of natural forces. Earthquakes shattered mountains. Fire rained from the sky. The very fabric of the cosmos was said to tremble under the weight of their struggle. The role of Gaia in the Titanomachy is complex. Though she had once supported Cronus in overthrowing Uranus, she now supported Zeus and the Olympians. This shifting allegiance suggests Gaia's enduring concern for balance and justice rather than loyalty to any single generation. She represents the earth itself, timeless, impartial, and ever watchful over the cycles of power. In one of the climactic moments of the war, the Titanomachy began hurling massive stones at the Titans, overwhelming them with sheer force. The Titans, once rulers of the cosmos, could not withstand the combined power of the Olympians and their newfound allies. Eventually, one by one, they were defeated. The final blow came when Zeus and his brothers captured the leading Titans and cast them into Tartarus, the deep abyss far beneath the underworld. There, they were imprisoned behind bronze gates and guarded by the Titanomachy. This act was not just punishment. It was a permanent statement. The age of the Titans was over. A new divine order had begun. Not all Titans met the same fate. Oceanus, for example, remained neutral and was spared. Prometheus and his brother Prometheus had supported the Olympians and were rewarded. Themis, goddess of divine law, also aligned with Zeus, helping to establish the moral and cosmic order of the new age. One of the most fascinating figures to emerge from the aftermath was Atlas. As one of the Titans who fought fiercely against Zeus, Atlas received a unique punishment. Rather than being cast into Tartarus, he was condemned to stand at the edge of the world and hold up the sky for eternity. This image, of a lone figure bearing the heavens, is one of the most enduring symbols of burden and endurance in Greek mythology. With the war won, Zeus and his brothers divided the cosmos among themselves. This division was not arbitrary. It reflected the realms in which each god would exercise power and influence. Zeus claimed the sky and became king of the gods. Poseidon took the sea, ruling over oceans, storms, and earthquakes. Hades received the underworld, becoming the ruler of the dead and the unseen. Earth, Gaia's domain, remained shared among all gods, as it could not belong to one alone. The Titanomachy serves multiple purposes in Greek mythology. On the surface, it is a tale of divine war, but beneath that, it is a story of transformation. It marks the shift from an older, more abstract divine order to a newer pantheon that resembled humanity more closely. The Olympian gods had individual personalities, emotions, and flaws. They quarreled, fell in love, sought revenge, and made mistakes. This human-like quality made them more relatable and central to the stories that shaped Greek religion and culture. The war also established the rule of Zeus, whose authority became the anchor of mythological order. Yet even Zeus, for all his power, was not immune to the lessons of the past. Like Uranus and Cronus before him, he would one day face the threat of being overthrown. But unlike his predecessors, Zeus took steps to prevent the cycle by seeking wisdom and sharing power where possible. His efforts would not always succeed, but they showed a shift in the pattern, an attempt to rule through balance rather than suppression alone. The Titanomachy also provided a mythic explanation for the landscape of the world. The scars of war were said to be visible in volcanic eruptions, earthquakes, and other natural phenomena. The Greeks used myth not only to explain the gods, but also to understand their environment. The thunderbolt, the stormy seas, the dark depths of the earth, all had roots in divine struggle. In a broader cultural sense, the story reflected Greek values of courage, intelligence, and justice. Zeus did not win through brute force alone. He used strategy, sought allies, and corrected past injustices. His leadership contrasted with Cronus's fear and Uranus's cruelty. In this way, the myth provided a model for wise rulership, not perfect, but aware of history and mindful of consequences. With the Titans defeated and the Olympians in power, the cosmos had entered a new era. The structure of the world was now in place, and the major gods had taken their thrones. Yet the story of Greek mythology was far from complete. The gods, now established, would begin to shape the world of mortals, creating and guiding humanity in ways both generous and tragic. With the Titans defeated and imprisoned deep within Tartarus, the Olympians stood as the new masters of the universe. The victory of Zeus and his siblings over the elder gods did not only signify a change in leadership, it marked the beginning of a new divine structure with realms and responsibilities divided among the chief gods. This was not a return to the chaotic past, but the formalization of order. To preserve peace and avoid repeating the errors of Cronus and Uranus, the newly established gods sought balance. At the heart of this restructuring stood Zeus, now recognized as the leader of the Olympian gods. His rule, however, was not founded on autocratic control. Instead, Zeus emphasized distribution and cooperation. The cosmos was too vast, too diverse, to be governed by one deity alone. To stabilize the divine hierarchy and avoid the rivalries that had plagued previous generations, Zeus and his two brothers, Poseidon and Hades, agreed to divide the universe into three major realms. To ensure fairness, the division was determined by casting lots. This method, drawing lots, was an ancient practice recognized across the Greek world as a means of preventing favoritism. By leaving the outcome to chance, or perhaps to fate, the gods accepted the results as legitimate and final. Zeus drew the sky. This domain made him not only the god of weather and storms, but also the ruler of celestial order. The sky in Greek thought symbolized vision, authority, and permanence. From the heights of Mount Olympus, Zeus would watch over both gods and mortals, his thunderbolt always within reach. Poseidon drew the sea. This realm was vast, unpredictable, and essential to Greek life. As a seafaring culture, the Greeks respected and feared the ocean. Poseidon's domain extended not only over the seas and oceans, but also over earthquakes and horses, symbols of raw power and untamed nature. His presence was often felt in coastal towns, and he held particular prominence in maritime cities like Corinth. Hades, the third brother, received the underworld. Though often associated with death, Hades was not considered evil. His role was to maintain the balance between life and death, ensuring that souls were judged and guided to their appropriate resting places. His realm was vast, stretching beneath the earth, and included not only the place of the dead, but also the sources of precious metals and minerals. Wealth, after all, came from below, and so Hades was sometimes referred to as Pluton, meaning wealth giver. This division was not merely a mythological convenience. It reflected how the ancient Greeks understood the structure of the world. The sky, the sea, and the underworld represented the vertical layers of existence, each with its own logic and divine ruler. The earth, meanwhile, was considered neutral ground. It belonged to none of the three brothers exclusively and remained the shared domain of gods and mortals alike. Gaia, as Earth itself, continued to exist outside of this division, a constant and unchanging presence. The division of the cosmos also marked the emergence of Olympus as the political and spiritual center of divine affairs. Mount Olympus, the highest peak in Greece, became the seat of the Olympian gods. While the mountain itself was real, located in northern Thessaly, the mythic Olympus was envisioned as a place of pure radiance and perfection, untouched by weather or decay. There, the gods would gather in council, feast on ambrosia, and oversee the world below. The significance of Olympus went beyond geography. It symbolized unity and order, a place where disputes could be resolved and where divine will could be expressed. Zeus, as king of the gods, presided over this council, but he was not above persuasion or opposition. Unlike the tyrannical rule of Cronus or the distant reign of Uranus, the Olympian model emphasized negotiation and deliberation. This new order was not without its challenges. The gods who did not receive a realm of their own still held important roles. Hera, the sister and wife of Zeus, became goddess of marriage and queen of the gods. Demeter took on the realm of agriculture, ensuring the fertility of the land and the cycle of the seasons. Hestia, though less prominent in myths, was vital in every household and temple as the goddess of the hearth. Athena, Apollo, Artemis, Hephaestus, Ares, Hermes, and other Olympians would join the pantheon over time, each bringing unique domains and stories. Their emergence would reflect the growing complexity of the Greek mythological landscape. But for now, the cosmos had been shaped into a coherent system, ruled by three powerful deities, each embodying a major realm of existence. One notable aspect of this arrangement was that it did not eliminate hierarchy or conflict. Zeus remained the most powerful and authoritative god. His role as king was not merely due to the realm he drew, but also because of his actions during and after the Titanomachy. He was the strategist, the liberator, and the one who restored balance. As a result, the other gods, even his brothers, acknowledged his leadership. Despite this, Zeus's authority was not absolute. The myths often depict him facing resistance from mortals, from other gods, and even from fate itself. In one well-known episode, Hera, Poseidon, and Athena conspired to overthrow Zeus, frustrated by his autocratic decisions. Though the rebellion failed, it revealed that the Olympians operated under a shared system where dialogue and rivalry were constant. The division of the cosmos also introduced the idea of boundaries, between divine domains, between life and death, between sea and land. These boundaries would be crossed frequently in myth, often with great consequence. Heroes would descend into the underworld, mortals would challenge the gods of the sky, and monsters would rise from the depths of the sea. But the structure itself remained intact, a lasting framework for Greek cosmology. Philosophers in later centuries, such as Plato and Aristotle, would engage with these myths not as literal truths, but as allegories for natural and moral order. The tripartite division of the world found echoes in their theories of the soul, the elements, and the structure of society. In this way, the mythological division of the cosmos shaped not only religious belief, but also intellectual life. From a cultural perspective, the roles of Zeus, Poseidon, and Hades reflected human experience. The sky was associated with law, vision, and storms, much like Zeus's role as ruler and judge. The sea represented danger, opportunity, and the unknown, mirrored in Poseidon's volatile nature. The underworld evoked the mysteries of death, memory, and wealth, qualities found in Hades's domain. Each realm required respect, ritual, and understanding. The Greeks made offerings to Poseidon before sea voyages, prayed to Hades for a peaceful death. and appealed to Zeus for justice and protection. This integration of mythology into daily life reinforced the relevance of these myths beyond storytelling. They became a lived reality. By establishing this threefold division, the Olympians did more than claim power. They created a mythic blueprint for the natural and spiritual order of the world. This structure allowed for both unity and diversity, authority and autonomy. And while it would be tested in countless ways, it remained the foundation of Greek mythology for centuries. With the divine order firmly established and the Olympian gods reigning over the cosmos, attention gradually shifted toward a new and significant chapter in the mythological narrative: the creation of humanity. This transition from purely divine struggles to the origin of mortals marked a turning point in Greek mythology. The gods were no longer battling each other for power. They were shaping the world, and within it, forming the beings who would live under their rule. The task of creating mankind did not fall to Zeus, nor to any of the Olympian deities. Instead, it was taken up by Prometheus, a titan who had fought alongside the Olympians during the Great War against Cronus and the elder gods. Unlike many of his kin, Prometheus was known for his intelligence, foresight, and empathy toward mortals. His name itself means forethought, reflecting his careful and strategic nature. Prometheus's role in the mythological tradition is unique. He is neither fully divine nor fully rebellious, neither a villain nor a flawless hero. Instead, he stands as a complex figure, a mediator between the gods and humanity, one who challenges divine authority for the sake of those he helps to create. According to Hesiod's Theogony and Works and Days, as well as later writers such as Aeschylus, Prometheus shaped the first humans from clay. In some versions, Athena is said to have breathed life into them, giving them spirit and consciousness. These first mortals were simple beings, fragile and unknowing. They lacked language, shelter, fire, and the means to protect themselves. Compared to the powerful gods and the majestic creatures of earlier myth, mankind was weak and dependent. Prometheus, however, saw potential in these new creations. He did not view them as inferior beings, but as capable of growth and development. It was this belief that set him on a path of defiance, one that would forever shape the relationship between gods and mortals. The first major confrontation between Prometheus and Zeus occurred during a sacrificial ceremony at Mycone. Here, Prometheus played a clever trick to test Zeus's favor toward humankind. He prepared two offerings. One pile consisted of choice meat hidden inside a shabby-looking ox stomach, while the other was bones and fat wrapped in a gleaming layer of fat. When he presented both to Zeus, the king of the gods chose the more attractive portion, the one that looked rich but was in fact worthless. This act had lasting consequences. Zeus, upon realizing he had been deceived, declared that from then on, mortals would burn only the bones and fat to the gods while keeping the edible portions for themselves. In this way, Prometheus not only gained a practical advantage for humans, but also symbolized a deeper shift: the assertion of human cleverness in the face of divine power. But the greater offense was yet to come. In retaliation for the trick at Mycone, Zeus withheld fire from mankind. Without fire, humans remained helpless, unable to cook food, forge tools, or build civilizations. The gift of fire symbolized not only survival, but the spark of knowledge, invention, and culture. Prometheus, refusing to see his creations suffer, took it upon himself to defy Zeus once more. He stole fire from Olympus, some say from the forge of Hephaestus, or directly from the chariot of the sun, and carried it to earth, hidden inside a hollow fennel stalk. This was no minor theft. In the eyes of Zeus, Prometheus had committed an unforgivable act, elevating mortals closer to the divine, and doing so without permission. The punishment was swift and severe. Zeus ordered that Prometheus be bound in chains and taken to the farthest reaches of the earth, often identified as the Caucasus Mountains. There, he was fastened to a rock, and each day an eagle, the bird sacred to Zeus, descended to tear out his liver. Each night, the liver regenerated, and the torment began anew. This eternal punishment was meant not just to break Prometheus, but to send a message: the gods ruled by right, and defiance would not be tolerated. Prometheus's torment became one of the most enduring symbols of resistance and suffering in Greek mythology. It represented the cost of challenging authority and the burden of foresight. Despite his pain, Prometheus never expressed regret in most versions of the story. He stood by his actions, believing that the advancement of humanity justified the price. The myth of Prometheus also introduces an important concept in Greek thought: that knowledge and progress often come at a cost. The fire he gave humans brought light and warmth, but also danger and responsibility. With fire came metallurgy, warfare, and the power to change the world, for better or worse. Zeus's anger did not stop with Prometheus. According to Hesiod, the king of the gods devised another punishment, one not for the Titan, but for mankind. He ordered the creation of the first woman, Pandora. Crafted by Hephaestus from clay, adorned by Athena with grace and beauty, and given gifts by other gods, Pandora was sent to Earth with a sealed jar. In later retellings, the jar was mistranslated as a box, leading to the more familiar phrase, Pandora's box. Pandora's arrival marked the beginning of mortal suffering. When her curiosity compelled her to open the jar, all manner of evils escaped into the world: disease, hunger, war, and pain. Only one thing remained inside: hope. The myth served as an explanation for why life included hardship and why suffering was inseparable from the human condition. It also highlighted the complex and often contradictory relationship between gods and mortals. The gods gave gifts, but also imposed limits. They nurtured humanity, but also punished it for overstepping bounds. In the case of Prometheus, Zeus viewed compassion as betrayal. For mortals, the lesson was clear: divine favor could be fragile, and progress was always earned through struggle. Yet Prometheus's story did not end in endless torment. In later myths, particularly in the works of Aeschylus, he is eventually freed by the hero Heracles, who slays the eagle and breaks his chains. This liberation comes not from divine forgiveness, but from human valor, suggesting that courage and justice could prevail even in a world governed by gods. Prometheus remained a cultural icon for centuries. In classical Athens, he was admired as a symbol of wisdom and rebellion. In modern times, he has been interpreted as a prototype of the visionary thinker, the scientist, the revolutionary, who risks everything for the betterment of others. His story transcends mythology and speaks to universal themes: sacrifice, knowledge, resistance, and the enduring question of what it means to be human. The creation of mankind and the theft of fire marked the beginning of a new era in Greek mythology, one where mortals played an increasing role in the divine narrative. With the gift of fire, humanity entered the realm of invention, agriculture, and culture. The gods remained powerful, but their relationship with mortals became more dynamic, shaped by both generosity and conflict. The tale of Prometheus and his defiance had far-reaching consequences, not only for the rebellious Titan himself, but also for the world of mortals. Although Prometheus had given humanity the gift of fire and the possibility of progress, Zeus saw his actions as a dangerous overreach. The balance of power had been disturbed. Mortals, with fire in hand, were no longer entirely dependent on the gods. And so, Zeus turned his attention to a new plan, one that would reassert divine control by introducing both beauty and burden into the human world. According to the poet Hesiod, particularly in his works Theogony and Works and Days, Zeus conceived of a unique and unprecedented creation, the first woman. Until this point in Greek myth, humans had been male by default, or at least not gendered in a meaningful way. The arrival of a female figure was not simply a new addition, it was a profound shift in the mythological structure of the human experience. Zeus summoned Hephaestus, the god of fire and craftsmanship, and instructed him to mold a figure from earth and water, a form both beautiful and deceptive. Hephaestus obeyed, shaping a woman of striking appearance. Athena then breathed life into her, clothing her in a silvery robe and adorning her with a gleaming crown and a veil of mystery. Aphrodite gave her charm and irresistible beauty, while Hermes placed in her a cunning mind and a deceptive tongue. Other gods added various traits: grace, curiosity, persuasion, even treachery. She was given the name Pandora, which means all-gifted, for every god had contributed something to her creation. But Pandora was more than a divine masterpiece. She was, in Zeus's view, a calculated response to Prometheus's disobedience. Prometheus had given humanity an advantage. Now Zeus would deliver a counterbalance, something alluring and fatal, designed not to destroy mankind outright, but to complicate their lives irreversibly. Pandora was sent to Earth as a gift, or rather a trap, for Epimetheus, the brother of Prometheus. Although Prometheus had warned Epimetheus never to accept gifts from Zeus, the warning went unheeded. When Pandora arrived, radiant and gentle, Epimetheus welcomed her without question. In doing so, he unwittingly opened the door to a new chapter in human existence. Along with Pandora came a jar, what later tradition inaccurately translated as a box. This jar, sealed and mysterious, was said to contain many things, though its true contents were unknown to mortals. Pandora, driven by the curiosity gifted to her by the gods, eventually lifted the lid. In that moment, all the evils that had been sealed inside escaped into the world. Out flew disease, sorrow, jealousy, old age, hunger, madness, and countless other forms of human suffering. These were not merely misfortunes, they were the conditions that would define human life from that moment forward. The world was no longer a place of ease and balance. It became a realm of struggle, hardship, and loss. By the time Pandora managed to close the jar, only one thing remained inside: hope. What exactly hope meant in this context is a subject of long philosophical debate. Was hope a consolation left behind to ease human suffering? Or was it another deceit, a means of prolonging human endurance in a painful world? The ancient Greeks themselves offered no single answer, leaving the myth open to interpretation. The myth of Pandora served several purposes in Greek thought. On the surface, it provided an explanation for why the world is filled with hardship. Before Pandora, humans had lived in a state of innocence and comfort. After her arrival, they were condemned to face suffering, not as punishment for wrongdoing, but as the inevitable result of divine design. More subtly, the myth reflected Greek attitudes toward gender, curiosity, and the limits of knowledge. Pandora was not portrayed as evil, but her actions were viewed as the catalyst for a fall from grace. This echoed similar themes found in other ancient traditions, such as the story of Eve in the Hebrew Bible. In both cases, a woman, through an act of disobedience or curiosity, brings about a transformation that reshapes the human condition. The story also warned of the dangers of hubris, of pushing too far against divine limits. Prometheus's gift of fire was noble, but it disrupted the natural order. Pandora's curiosity was human, but it unleashed irreversible consequences. These myths suggest that wisdom lies not only in power and intelligence, but also in restraint. For women in ancient Greek society, the myth of Pandora had lasting cultural implications. It reinforced the idea of woman as both necessary and dangerous, essential for human life, but potentially disruptive. This perception shaped how women were viewed in Greek literature, politics, and daily life. While real women in ancient Greece lived diverse and often complex lives, the mythic symbolism of Pandora cast a long shadow over cultural expectations. Despite the bleakness of the story, the presence of hope within the jar complicates the message. The Greeks recognized that even in a world filled with suffering, humans found ways to endure. Hope, whether seen as a gift or a delusion, remained a powerful force. It allowed people to dream, to strive, and to believe in something better, even when reason told them otherwise. The legacy of Pandora extended well beyond Hesiod's works. Later poets, dramatists, and philosophers returned to her story as a way to explore deeper questions about fate, freedom, and human nature. In tragedy, she became a symbol of unintended consequences. In philosophy, she became a metaphor for the complexity of life itself. In modern times, the term Pandora's box has become shorthand for actions that unleash uncontrollable problems. But the original myth is richer and more nuanced. It is not simply a warning against curiosity or a condemnation of women. It is a story about balance, the tension between gift and burden, between curiosity and caution, between punishment and resilience. Pandora did not cause suffering out of malice. She acted according to the nature given to her by the gods. And in doing so, she revealed a truth that runs through all of Greek mythology, that human life is defined not by perfection, but by complexity. The gods themselves were not perfect, and neither were their creations. But within that imperfection lay the potential for meaning, for beauty, and for hope. In the wake of Pandora's opening of the jar, humanity entered a new era. The divine gifts and punishments continued to shape their lives, but now mortals were aware of their vulnerability. They faced illness, death, and misfortune, but they also possessed fire, thought, and perseverance. The world was no longer simple, but it was more fully human. Following the mythic rise of the Olympian gods and the shaping of humanity through both divine gift and punishment, Greek mythology enters a new phase. This is the beginning of the so-called Age of Heroes, a period marked by the deeds of mortals who stood between gods and men. Yet, before this heroic age could truly begin, the world had to endure a second foundational crisis, a catastrophic flood sent by Zeus to cleanse the earth of human corruption. The idea of a great flood appears in many ancient traditions, from Mesopotamian epics to the Hebrew Bible. In Greek mythology, this deluge is known as the Flood of Deucalion. It marks both an end and a new beginning, the destruction of an early, flawed version of humanity, and the rebirth of a world capable of giving rise to legendary heroes. The background to the flood centers on the degeneration of humankind. After Pandora opened the jar and released suffering into the world, humans gradually declined in virtue and morality. This theme is central to Hesiod's works and days, where he describes a succession of human ages: gold, silver, bronze, heroic, and iron. According to this schema, the Bronze Age, which preceded the flood, was an era of violence and greed. People no longer honored the gods. Lawlessness and arrogance spread across the earth, disrupting the cosmic balance. Zeus, as the ruler of the gods and upholder of justice, observed this moral decay with growing anger. According to the myth, he decided that humanity must be purged. But rather than destroy the world with fire or war, Zeus chose water, an element both cleansing and annihilating. He resolved to drown the entire race of humans and begin again. However, there were exceptions. Among the few mortals who retained piety and virtue were Deucalion and his wife, Hera. Deucalion was the son of Prometheus, while Hera was the daughter of Prometheus and Pandora. This lineage connected them both to the very origin of humanity and the divine acts that shaped it. Unlike the corrupted masses, Deucalion and Hera still honored the gods, lived justly, and preserved the ancient values of respect and humility. Prometheus, still in possession of divine foresight even while punished or after being freed, depending on the version, warned his son of the coming disaster. Following his father's counsel, Deucalion constructed a large chest or ark, filling it with provisions and preparing to endure what was to come. As the rains began to fall and the seas rose, Zeus unleashed his judgment. For 9 days and 9 nights, torrential rain covered the earth. Rivers overflowed, lakes merged into seas, and the mountains themselves became islands in an endless ocean. Humanity was wiped out. The old cities, temples, and fields disappeared beneath the waters. Only Deucalion and Hera, safe inside their vessel, floated above the chaos, preserved by their righteousness and divine favor. When the floodwaters finally receded, their chest came to rest upon Mount Parnassus in central Greece. Emerging onto the barren earth, the couple found a world emptied of human life. Yet the gods, recognizing their piety, had spared them not only for survival, but for a greater task, the repopulation of the human race. Confused about how to proceed without violating the sacred order, Deucalion and Hera turned to the oracle of Themis, the titaness of divine law and prophecy. They prayed for guidance, asking how they might restore humanity without committing impiety. Themis gave them a cryptic answer: "Cover your heads and cast behind you the bones of your mother." At first, the couple hesitated, puzzled by the obscure wording. Eventually, they interpreted the phrase metaphorically. Mother referred not to their literal mother, but to Gaia, the earth, and her bones were the stones of the ground. Trusting this interpretation, Deucalion and Hera veiled themselves and began throwing stones over their shoulders. As the stones struck the earth, they began to transform. The ones Deucalion threw became men. Those cast by Hera became women. In this way, the human race was born anew, not created directly by the gods, but regenerated through an act of symbolic understanding, piety, and cleverness. These new people were stronger, more enduring, and better suited to the hardships of a post-flood world. This version of humanity born of stone reflects a powerful theme in Greek mythology: resilience. No longer naive or living in unearned comfort, mortals were now forged through suffering and transformation. They would carry the memory of divine punishment and the burden of survival. Yet they would also rise to greatness. The myth of Deucalion and the flood served several functions in Greek cultural thought. It explained the end of a corrupted human race and justified a new beginning. It highlighted the importance of divine respect and ethical living. And it reinforced the idea that wisdom, humility, and piety could lead to salvation, even in the face of cosmic disaster. Moreover, the flood myth provided a transition into the age of heroes. The people born after the flood were tougher, shaped not by luxury, but by necessity. They would go on to become the parents and ancestors of Greece's greatest legendary figures, heroes like Perseus, Heracles, and Achilles. This shift marks a movement in myth from the origin of the world to the shaping of civilization. The gods remained powerful, but now humans had their own space to act, strive, and struggle. Deucalion himself did not become a prominent hero in the way later figures would, but he remained a symbol of renewal and moral integrity. His son, Helen, not to be confused with Helen of Troy, became the legendary ancestor of the Hellenes, or Greeks. From Helen's sons came the major Greek tribes, the Dorians, Ionians, Aeolians, and Achaeans. Thus, the myth of Deucalion also served to explain the origin of the Greek people and their cultural identity. The mythic geography associated with the flood added further depth. Mount Parnassus, where Deucalion's ark came to rest, became a site of spiritual and cultural significance. Later associated with Apollo and the Muses, it stood as a place where divine inspiration met human endeavor. The idea that human civilization could begin anew from this sacred mountain reinforced its status in Greek religious imagination. In terms of narrative structure, the flood of Deucalion functions as both a cleansing and a reset. It echoes the earlier chaos that birthed the world, but refocuses the mythic lens on human responsibility. Where once the cosmos was shaped by divine battles, now it was shaped by human action, by choices, prayers, interpretations, and persistence. Importantly, the gods do not disappear from the story. Zeus remains a figure of ultimate authority, enforcing cosmic justice. Themis guides humanity through riddles and symbols, but the power dynamic has shifted. Mortals are no longer mere creations. They are now participants in the divine order, capable of understanding, interpreting, and shaping their fate. The flood of Deucalion is more than a tale of survival. It is a statement about humanity's place in the mythological world. It bridges the gap between creation myths and heroic legends, between divine will and human struggle. The world that emerged from the waters was harder, but also richer. A world where the greatest stories of mortal courage, cleverness, and tragedy were about to unfold. With the floodwaters of Deucalion's time receding and a new generation of mortals populating the earth, Greek mythology shifts into its next great phase, the emergence of heroes. But these were not ordinary men and women. This era saw the rise of beings who stood between gods and mortals, individuals born from the union of divine and human, known as demigods. They were powerful, ambitious, flawed, and destined for greatness or tragedy. Their stories formed the very backbone of Greek mythology, shaping cultural ideals and providing the foundation for epic tales that would endure for millennia. The notion of gods taking mortal lovers is not unique to Greek myth, but nowhere else is it as central or as culturally celebrated. These unions often involved Zeus, but other gods like Poseidon, Apollo, and even Hermes also fathered or mothered children with mortals. These children were not immortal, but they often possessed extraordinary strength, intelligence, or beauty. They were heroes, not in the modern sense of moral perfection, but in the classical sense of being set apart by fate and exceptional ability. The rise of demigods reflected several key cultural themes for the ancient Greeks. First, it offered a divine explanation for the existence of greatness among mortals. Kings, warriors, founders of cities, all could trace their lineage back to the gods, reinforcing both their authority and their mythic legitimacy. Second, the stories of demigods explored the limits of human potential and the consequences of crossing divine boundaries. Among the earliest and most important demigods was Perseus, born to Danae, a mortal woman, and Zeus. Danae's father, King Acrisius of Argos, had been warned by an oracle that his grandson would one day kill him. In a desperate attempt to prevent this fate, he locked Danae in a bronze chamber. But Zeus, undeterred, visited her in the form of golden rain. From this union, Perseus was born. Fearing the prophecy, Acrisius cast mother and child into the sea in a wooden chest, but they survived and were taken in by a kind fisherman on the island of Seriphos. Perseus's story would eventually lead him to slay the Gorgon Medusa, a monstrous creature with snakes for hair whose gaze could turn men to stone. With divine aid from Athena and Hermes, Perseus succeeded, using a mirrored shield, winged sandals, and a magical sickle. His adventures continued with the rescue of Andromeda and the eventual founding of the city of Mycenae. Perseus's tale marked a pattern seen in many heroic myths: divine birth, prophetic threat, abandonment or hardship, a dangerous quest, and eventual triumph. Another foundational figure was Heracles, perhaps the most iconic of all Greek heroes. The son of Zeus and the mortal Alcmene, Heracles was born into conflict. Hera, Zeus's wife, was infuriated by yet another of her husband's infidelities and sought to destroy the child. Heracles faced divine hostility from birth, a theme that would define much of his life. Despite this, or perhaps because of it, he achieved greatness through a series of labors, trials, and redemptive acts. His strength, perseverance, and suffering made him a model of heroic endurance. What made demigods like Heracles different from full gods was not merely their mortality, but their ability to suffer. While the Olympians were powerful and often indifferent, the heroes struggled. They faced challenges from both the mortal and divine realms. In doing so, they reflected the human condition in a way the gods never could. They had desires, made mistakes, endured loss, and sought meaning in a world that was often hostile or indifferent. The existence of demigods also served to explain the heroic age in which many Greek myths were set. This age was seen as a unique period between the time of gods and the time of ordinary men. It was an era when the boundaries between divine and human were porous, when the children of gods could walk the earth, and when the deeds of a single man could change the fate of nations. In Hesiod's view, it was the only heroic age that stood apart from decline, the only time that mortals achieved something worthy of immortality. Another pair of demigods who bridged the mortal and divine were Castor and Pollux, also known as the Dioscuri. Sons of Leda, their paternity was divided. Pollux was the son of Zeus, while Castor was fathered by a mortal, King Tyndareus. Despite this, the twins were inseparable. When Castor died, Pollux begged Zeus to allow them to remain together. As a result, they were transformed into the constellation Gemini eternally side by side. Their story emphasized brotherhood, loyalty, and the blending of mortality and divinity. Helen of Troy, the sister of Castor and Pollux, also emerged from this complex genealogy. According to many versions of the myth, she too was a daughter of Zeus and Leda, and her beauty would later ignite the most famous war in Greek mythology. Her divine heritage elevated her from being merely a queen or consort. She became a symbol of desire, power, and the tragic consequences of divine human entanglement. Poseidon also fathered numerous heroic offspring. Among them was Theseus, who would later become the hero of Athens. While some traditions held that his mortal father was King Aegeus, others claimed Poseidon as his true sire. Theseus's story included the slaying of the Minotaur and the navigation of the deadly labyrinth, solidifying him as a civic hero tied to the founding and identity of Athens itself. The presence of demigods in nearly every major Greek city and mythological cycle reflected a deep cultural function. They were not just characters in entertaining stories. They were ancestral figures, civic symbols, and moral examples. They provided a link between mortals and gods, between myth and history. Importantly, not all demigods were male. Women of semi-divine status also played key roles in myth, though often their stories were more tragic. Semele, the mortal mother of Dionysus, was a lover of Zeus and died upon witnessing his true form. Danae, as mentioned earlier, was persecuted because of prophecy. Andromeda, wife of Perseus, was chained to a rock as a sacrifice to a sea monster before being rescued. These women were often used to explore themes of vulnerability, divine justice, and transformation. The rise of demigods signaled the beginning of a new narrative direction in Greek mythology. Where the earliest stories concerned the birth of the cosmos and the struggles of divine power, the heroic myths turned toward the individual. They asked what it meant to be human in a world shaped by gods. Could a mortal rise above his fate? Could strength, courage, or cleverness overcome divine obstacles? These questions became the heart of Greek myth. As the heroic age gained momentum, these demigods would go on to undertake epic quests, fight monsters, found cities, and even challenge the gods themselves. Some would ascend to immortality, while others would fall in tragedy. But all of them would leave behind stories that defined Greek identity, inspired generations of poets and historians, and shaped the Western imagination. Among the earliest and most enduring heroes of Greek mythology stands Perseus, the son of Zeus and the mortal Danae. His story, like many heroic narratives that would follow, is built around a divinely sanctioned quest, supernatural enemies, and the acquisition of tools gifted by the gods. But what sets Perseus apart is not only his parentage or strength, but his cleverness and ability to navigate challenges that seemed impossible to overcome. The slaying of Medusa remains one of the most iconic episodes in Greek myth, and its implications reach far beyond a single act of heroism. The story of Perseus begins, as many myths do, with a prophecy. Danae's father, King Acrisius of Argos, received a dire warning from the oracle of Delphi. His daughter would bear a son who would one day cause his death. Terrified by this revelation, Acrisius imprisoned Danae in a sealed underground chamber made of bronze, designed to be escape-proof and man-proof. Yet no prison could stop the will of Zeus. The king of the gods visited Danae in the form of golden rain, a mysterious and divine manifestation, and from this union Perseus was conceived. When Acrisius discovered the child, he was too fearful of divine retribution to commit murder directly. Instead, he placed Danae and the infant Perseus into a wooden chest and cast them into the sea, trusting the waves to fulfill the prophecy without his direct hand. But fate intervened. The chest floated safely to the island of Seriphus, where it was discovered by Dictys, a kind fisherman who took in the mother and child and raised Perseus as his own. Years passed, and Perseus grew into a strong and intelligent young man. On the island, however, a new threat emerged. Dictys's brother, King Polydectes, became infatuated with Danae. When his advances were rejected, he turned his hostility toward Perseus. To remove the young man from the picture, Polydectes devised a cunning plan. He announced that he was to marry another woman and requested gifts from all the men of the island. When Perseus arrived empty-handed, Polydectes mocked him. In defiance, Perseus boldly promised to bring him the head of Medusa, the most feared of the 3 Gorgon sisters. This promise, made in pride and perhaps ignorance, set Perseus on a path from which there was no retreat. Medusa was no ordinary monster. Once a beautiful woman, she had been transformed by Athena into a hideous creature with snakes for hair and a gaze that turned anyone who looked directly at her into stone. Her 2 sisters, Stheno and Euryale, were immortal, but Medusa alone was mortal, and thus the only one that could be slain. Realizing the enormity of his task, Perseus prayed to the gods for help. His prayers were answered. Athena, the goddess of wisdom and warfare, and Hermes, the messenger god, took interest in the young hero. Athena, who had once cursed Medusa, now sought to guide her slayer. She gave Perseus a polished bronze shield, which could reflect Medusa's image without danger. Hermes gifted him an adamantine sickle, sharp enough to sever the toughest flesh. But even with these tools, Perseus could not simply march into the Gorgon's lair. To locate Medusa, he first had to find the Graeae, 3 ancient sisters who shared a single eye and a single tooth. These strange beings, older than the gods themselves, lived in a remote and shadowy land. Perseus located them and, using cunning rather than force, stole their eye while it was being passed between them. In exchange for its return, they revealed the way to the Hesperides, guardians of other divine objects he would need. At the edge of the world, near the dwelling of the Hesperides, Perseus acquired 3 vital items: a kibisis, or magical bag, capable of safely containing Medusa's head; a helmet of invisibility, sometimes attributed to Hades, which would allow him to vanish from sight; and winged sandals that granted him the power of flight. With these, Perseus was ready to confront the Gorgons. He flew to their lair, a desolate and petrified landscape where the remains of former victims stood frozen in eternal terror. Approaching in silence, Perseus avoided Medusa's deadly gaze by using the polished shield as a mirror. Guided by Athena's voice, he crept closer, and with one swift motion severed her head. From Medusa's blood sprang 2 remarkable beings, Pegasus, the winged horse, and Chrysaor, a warrior often depicted with a golden sword. These were the offspring of Poseidon, for Medusa had once lain with the sea god before her transformation. Perseus quickly placed the head into the kibisis and, with the helmet of invisibility, fled the enraged immortal sisters who pursued him. His return journey was not without further heroics. While flying over the kingdom of Ethiopia, Perseus spotted a young woman chained to a rock by the sea, Andromeda, daughter of King Cepheus and Queen Cassiopeia. The queen had angered the sea god Poseidon by boasting that her daughter was more beautiful than the Nereids, his sea nymphs. As punishment, Poseidon sent a sea monster to ravage the land. The only way to appease him was to sacrifice Andromeda. Moved by her plight and perhaps struck by her beauty, Perseus agreed to save her. As the monster rose from the sea, he used Medusa's head to turn it into stone. Andromeda was freed and later became his wife. This act of saving a princess from a monster became a recurring motif in later hero tales, from Bellerophon to Heracles. Upon his return to Seriphos, Perseus found that Polydectes had not changed. The king continued to harass Danae and held power through fear. In a dramatic final confrontation, Perseus entered the king's court and revealed Medusa's head, turning Polydectes and his followers to stone. Justice was swift and final. Dictys, his foster father, was made king in his place. Though Perseus had completed his quest and restored peace to Seriphos, his story was not yet over. He eventually returned to Argos, where the prophecy that had begun his life still loomed. In one version of the tale, Acrisius fled upon hearing that Perseus was alive, fearing the fulfillment of the oracle. Later, during athletic games, Perseus accidentally struck and killed Acrisius with a discus, thus fulfilling the prophecy he had tried so hard to avoid. Perseus's tale carries many of the key themes of Greek heroism: the overcoming of monstrous foes, the favor and guidance of the gods, the use of cleverness over brute force, and the ever-present role of fate. His story also reflects the evolution of myth into morality, a movement away from chaos and violence toward justice and order. Unlike later heroes who suffered more tragic fates, Perseus's story ends relatively peacefully. He founded the city of Mycenae, one of the great centers of Greek civilization. In some versions, he and Andromeda were set among the stars, immortalized as constellations. This elevation to the heavens signified not only divine favor but the cultural importance of his legacy. Perseus's victory over Medusa also had long-lasting symbolic meaning. The Gorgon's head, known as the Gorgonion, became a protective symbol in Greek art and architecture, often placed on shields, temples, and armor. It served not only as a reminder of the hero's triumph, but as a talisman against evil and chaos. What makes Perseus's myth particularly influential is the way it combines adventure, divine guidance, moral justice, and personal transformation. It set a narrative structure that would be echoed in countless later myths and even modern storytelling. His use of magical items, rescue of a damsel, and triumph over monsters became foundational elements in heroic tradition. As Greek mythology shifted its focus toward the lives of mortals touched by divinity, a new kind of hero emerged, one who did not rely solely on the favor of the gods or the use of magical tools, but on intelligence, political awareness, and personal sacrifice. Theseus, the legendary founder hero of Athens, embodied this transformation. His story represents not only a thrilling mythological adventure, but also a reflection of the cultural and civic values that the Athenians would later hold dear. Theseus was born of complex parentage. His mother, Aethra, was a mortal princess, daughter of King Pythias of Trojan. According to most versions of the myth, his father was Aegeus, the king of Athens, though some traditions claim that Poseidon, god of the sea, also lay with Aethra on the same night. This dual paternity, both mortal and divine, was not uncommon among heroes and further elevated Theseus's status. Before returning to Athens, Aegeus left a sword and a pair of sandals hidden beneath a heavy rock, instructing Aethra that if her son could one day lift the rock and retrieve these items, he would be worthy of claiming his heritage. When Theseus came of age and accomplished this task, he chose not to travel to Athens by sea, the easier and safer route, but instead by land, a path riddled with danger. This decision would be the first of many that demonstrated Theseus's courage and his commitment to facing challenges directly. On his journey to Athens, Theseus encountered and defeated a series of bandits and monsters that terrorized the roads. Each villain he met was known for a particular form of brutality: Periphetes. The club-bearer crushed travelers with his iron weapon. Cenes, the pine-bender, tore victims apart using bent trees. Siren forced passers-by to wash his feet before kicking them into the sea, and Procrustes stretched or amputated travelers to make them fit his bed. Theseus defeated each of them by turning their own methods against them, symbolizing not only strength but poetic justice. By the time he reached Athens, Theseus had established himself as a true hero. However, his welcome in the city was complicated. Aegeus had taken a new wife, the sorceress Medea, who feared that the arrival of the young stranger threatened her position. She persuaded Aegeus to poison him during a banquet. Just as Theseus raised his cup, the king recognized his son's sword and dashed it from his hands, narrowly preventing tragedy. Medea fled, and Theseus was acknowledged as the Prince of Athens. It was around this time that Athens found itself under the shadow of a grim obligation. Years earlier, King Minos of Crete had lost his son Androgeos during a visit to Athens. Whether Androgeos was murdered or died in an accident varies by source, but the result was the same. Minos waged war on Athens. After defeating the city, he imposed a cruel tribute. Every 9 years, Athens would send 7 young men and 7 young women to Crete to be sacrificed to the Minotaur, a monstrous half-man, half-bull creature kept in a labyrinth beneath the palace at Knossos. The Minotaur was itself the product of divine retribution and mortal error. Minos had once vowed to sacrifice a magnificent bull to Poseidon, but broke his promise and kept the animal. In punishment, the sea god caused Minos' wife Pasiphae to fall in love with the bull. The offspring of this unnatural union was the Minotaur. To contain it, Minos ordered the construction of the labyrinth, an intricate maze designed by the brilliant craftsman Daedalus, from which no one could escape. When the time came for Athens to send its latest tribute to Crete, Theseus volunteered to go. Some say it was an act of duty, others say it was motivated by the desire for glory. Either way, his plan was clear. He would slay the Minotaur and end the blood payment once and for all. Before leaving, he promised his father that if he returned victorious, he would raise white sails on his ship. If he failed, the sails would remain black. Upon arriving in Crete, Theseus caught the attention of Ariadne, the daughter of King Minos. Struck by his bravery, or perhaps guided by divine will, Ariadne chose to help him. She gave him a sword to fight the Minotaur and a ball of thread, which he was to tie at the entrance of the labyrinth and unwind as he moved forward. This simple yet ingenious device would allow him to retrace his steps and escape the maze, a symbol of intelligence overcoming brute confusion. Theseus entered the labyrinth, found the Minotaur, and engaged in a fierce battle. Accounts of the fight vary, but in all versions, Theseus triumphed. He slew the beast and used the thread to navigate back to the entrance, bringing the other Athenian youths with him. The tribute was over, the cycle of death broken. With Ariadne, Theseus fled Crete under the cover of night. But their journey home was marred by betrayal or tragedy. On the island of Naxos, Theseus abandoned Ariadne. Some versions claim he did so because the gods commanded it. Dionysus, in particular, wished to take Ariadne as his wife. Others suggest Theseus simply acted out of callousness or political calculation. Whatever the reason, Ariadne's fate took a different turn, and Theseus continued to Athens alone. In one of the most tragic moments of the myth, Theseus forgot to change the ship's sails from black to white. Aegeus, watching from the cliffs of Sunion, saw the black sails approaching and, believing his son to be dead, threw himself into the sea. The body of water that received him has since been called the Aegean Sea in his memory. Theseus returned to find himself king, but at the cost of his father's life. Theseus's journey did not end with the slaying of the Minotaur. As king of Athens, he would go on to reform the city, centralizing its government and laying the foundation for its later democratic ideals. He would embark on further adventures, including journeys to the underworld, campaigns alongside other heroes, and episodes involving betrayal and loss. But it is his victory in the labyrinth that most defines his legacy. The myth of Theseus was deeply tied to Athenian identity. Unlike Heracles, whose labors took him across the known world, Theseus was a civic hero. His story emphasized reason, reform, and the triumph of order over chaos. His slaying of the Minotaur was not just a feat of strength, it was an act of liberation, freeing his people from humiliation and asserting Athenian values in the face of foreign oppression. In art, literature, and political rhetoric, Theseus was held up as the model of the ideal citizen hero, brave, intelligent, and self-sacrificing. Temples and monuments in Athens were dedicated to him, and festivals celebrated his deeds. He was not only a figure of myth, but a symbol of what it meant to be Athenian. Yet his story also contains reminders of human frailty. The abandonment of Ariadne, the forgetfulness that led to his father's death, and the later tragedies of his reign suggest that even the greatest heroes are fallible. Theseus, like all figures in Greek mythology, was not perfect. He was heroic, yes, but also deeply human. As the age of heroes advanced, Greek mythology reached new levels of narrative complexity and collective ambition. While Perseus and Theseus had completed heroic quests largely alone, Jason's journey was different. His story, centered on the quest for the Golden Fleece, was not only a personal mission, it was a group undertaking, a voyage filled with prophecy, divine rivalry, political intrigue, betrayal, and love. It brought together many of Greece's most celebrated heroes in a single legendary expedition, forming what would later be known as the Argonauts. Jason was the rightful heir to the throne of Iolcus, a kingdom in Thessaly. His father, Aeson, had been king, but was overthrown by his half-brother Peleus, who seized the throne and ruled in his place. Fearing for Jason's life, his family sent the boy away to be raised in secret by the centaur Chiron, a wise and noble creature who served as teacher to many Greek heroes. Under Chiron's guidance, Jason was educated in warfare, music, healing, and the ways of the gods. Years later, Jason returned to Iolcus as a young man, determined to reclaim his rightful inheritance. According to some traditions, he crossed a river and lost a sandal in the mud, a detail that would prove important, as an oracle had once warned Peleus to beware a man wearing only one sandal. When Jason appeared in his court, limping and barefoot, Peleus immediately recognized the threat. Peleus did not refuse Jason's claim outright. Instead, he proposed a seemingly impossible task. Jason must retrieve the golden fleece from the distant land of Colchis at the edge of the known world. The fleece was the hide of a magical golden ram that had once carried the children of Nephili, a cloud nymph, away from danger. After the ram was sacrificed, its fleece was hung in a sacred grove and guarded by a never-sleeping dragon. To Peleus, the quest was a death sentence disguised as an honor. Jason accepted the challenge. To undertake the voyage, he assembled a crew of Greece's greatest young heroes. Among them were Heracles, Orpheus, Castor and Pollux, Meleager, Atalanta, and many others. The ship they sailed on was called the Argo, named after its builder, Argus, and protected by Athena herself. The crew became known as the Argonauts. Their journey eastward across the sea was long and perilous. Along the way, the Argonauts encountered a host of mythical creatures, dangerous trials, and divine interventions. Early in their voyage, they stopped at Lemnos, an island inhabited only by women. The Lemnian women had killed their husbands after being cursed by Aphrodite and had since lived in isolation. The Argonauts remained for some time, forming relationships and leaving behind children before continuing on their quest. Another early episode involved the Harpies, vile bird women who tormented the blind prophet Phineus by stealing and defiling his food. The Argonauts rescued him, and in return, Phineus gave them crucial information about their route, warning them of the Symplegades, two massive, crashing rocks that guarded a narrow sea passage. By releasing a dove to test the rocks and rowing swiftly after it, the Argo passed safely through. From then on, the Symplegades remained still, having been conquered by the will and bravery of the Argonauts. Eventually, the Argonauts reached Colchis, a mysterious kingdom on the eastern coast of the Black Sea, ruled by King Aeetes. The Golden Fleece was housed in a sacred grove, protected not only by a dragon, but also by the king's strict demands. Aeetes, unwilling to give up the fleece but bound by the customs of hospitality, offered Jason a grim bargain. He would grant the fleece, but only if Jason completed a series of impossible tasks: yoke a pair of fire-breathing oxen, plow a field with them, and sow the soil with dragon's teeth, teeth which, when planted, would grow into armed warriors. At this point, divine forces intervened once again. Hera, who had supported Jason from the beginning, persuaded Aphrodite to assist. Aphrodite sent Eros, the god of desire, to strike Medea, daughter of King Aeetes and a powerful sorceress, with love for Jason. Medea's passion for the hero set in motion one of the most tragic and consequential relationships in all of Greek mythology. Under the influence of love and perhaps divine manipulation, Medea agreed to help Jason complete the tasks in exchange for a promise of marriage. She gave him a magical ointment to protect him from the oxen's flames and advised him on how to defeat the earthborn warriors by throwing a stone among them, causing them to turn on each other in confusion. Jason succeeded in his trials, but King Aeetes refused to hand over the fleece. With no other choice, Medea led Jason to the sacred grove. There, she lulled the sleepless dragon to rest, either through potions, songs, or her own magic, and Jason stole the golden fleece. The Argonauts fled, with Medea aboard. Their escape from Colchis was anything but smooth. Aeates pursued them, and in one of the darkest episodes of the myth, Medea killed her own brother, Apsyrtus, and scattered his body into the sea. Aeates, devastated, paused to gather the remains, allowing the Argo to escape. This act of fratricide would later haunt Medea and stain Jason's triumph. The return voyage brought even more trials. At one point, the Argo passed by the island of the Sirens, creatures whose songs lured sailors to their deaths. Orpheus, the musician among the Argonauts, played his lyre to drown out their voices, saving the crew. They also encountered the bronze giant Talos, who guarded the island of Crete. Medea again intervened, using her magic to disable the giant by removing a plug from his ankle, draining his life force. Finally, the Argonauts returned to Iolcus with the Golden Fleece. But Jason's triumph did not bring peace. Peleus still refused to give up the throne. Medea took matters into her own hands. Using deception and magical trickery, she convinced Peleus's daughters to kill their father in a failed attempt to rejuvenate him. The result was chaos, and the couple was forced to flee to Corinth. There, Jason and Medea's relationship unraveled. Jason, seeking political gain, abandoned her to marry Glauce, the daughter of the king of Corinth. Betrayed and enraged, Medea enacted a horrific revenge. She killed Glauce, the king, and even her own children, though some versions of the myth offer different interpretations of this final act. Afterward, she escaped to Athens in a chariot drawn by dragons, provided by her grandfather Helios, the sun god. Jason's later years were marked by decline. Without Medea and stripped of his heroic aura, he returned to Iolcus alone. In one version of his death, he sat beside the rotting remains of the Argo, reflecting on his past. A beam from the ship collapsed and struck him, killing him instantly, an ignoble end for a once great hero. The quest for the Golden Fleece stands as one of the most expansive and multi-layered stories in Greek mythology. It blended adventure, romance, political ambition, and moral ambiguity. Unlike earlier heroes who acted alone, Jason required a team, divine assistance, and moral compromises. His success came at a high cost, personal, ethical, and emotional. This myth also introduced a different model of heroism. Jason was not the strongest nor the bravest, but he was a leader, a negotiator, and a figure shaped by forces beyond his control. Medea, meanwhile, remains one of the most complex figures in mythology, at once a victim, a villain, and a woman caught between divine power and human desire. Of all the heroes to emerge from Greek mythology, none is more widely recognized or deeply embedded in cultural memory than Heracles. Known to the Romans as Hercules, his name has become synonymous with strength, endurance, and heroism. Yet Heracles' story is not simply one of physical power. It is a tale of suffering, redemption, and the human struggle to overcome both inner demons and divine wrath. His life, marked by moments of both glory and madness, stands as one of the most complex narratives in the mythological tradition. Heracles was the son of Zeus and Alcmene, a mortal woman of Theban nobility. As with many of Zeus's affairs, this union incurred the wrath of Hera, Zeus's wife, who despised Heracles from the moment of his birth. In an attempt to thwart his destiny, Hera delayed Heracles' birth and ensured that another child, Eurystheus, would be born first, fulfilling a prophecy that the firstborn would rule over the others. Thus, from the beginning, Heracles was denied his rightful position and subjected to divine hostility. Even in infancy, Heracles displayed supernatural strength. When Hera sent 2 serpents to kill him in his cradle, he strangled them with his bare hands. As he grew, he was educated in music, archery, wrestling, and philosophy. However, his temper was volatile, and during a lesson, he killed his music teacher in a fit of rage. This early incident foreshadowed the inner conflict that would plague him throughout his life, a tension between his noble potential and uncontrollable impulses. Heracles' defining trial came in adulthood. Under Hera's influence, he was driven into a fit of madness and killed his wife Megara and their children. The enormity of this crime shattered Heracles' world. Seeking purification, he consulted the oracle of Delphi, who instructed him to serve Eurystheus, the king of Tiryns and Mycenae, for 12 years. During this period, he was to complete a series of labors, each more dangerous and impossible than the last. These tasks, known as the 12 labors of Heracles, would test every aspect of his strength, will, and endurance. The first labor was to slay the Nemean lion, a beast with impenetrable skin. Heracles strangled the lion with his bare hands, then used its own claws to skin it. He wore the pelt as armor, and its gaping jaws became his helmet, an image that would define his iconography forever. The second labor required him to destroy the Lernaean Hydra, a serpent-like creature with multiple heads. For every head he severed, 2 more grew back. With the help of his nephew Iolaus, Heracles cauterized each neck after decapitation to prevent regeneration. He dipped his arrows in the Hydra's poisonous blood, creating weapons of deadly potency. For the third labor, he was ordered to capture the Ceryneian hind, a sacred deer with golden antlers that belonged to Artemis. Heracles chased it for an entire year before finally catching it without harming it, a task that tested his patience rather than brute force. The fourth labor took him to Mount Erymanthos, where he captured the Erymanthian boar alive. During this episode, he also encountered the centaurs, leading to a violent clash. His presence often brought chaos, even when performing righteous tasks, further complicating his image as a hero. His fifth labor was to clean the Augean stables, which housed thousands of cattle and had not been cleaned in decades. Heracles accomplished this by diverting 2 rivers through the stables, completing the task in a single day. However, when he demanded payment from King Augeas, breaking the rules of the labor, it was disqualified by Eurystheus. The sixth task involved driving away the Stymphalian birds, man-eating creatures with bronze beaks and metal feathers. With the help of Athena, who provided a rattle to frighten them, Heracles shot them down as they fled. For the seventh labor, he traveled to Crete to capture the Cretan bull, which had been terrorizing the land. He wrestled it into submission and brought it back alive, displaying his ability to subdue chaos without killing it. The eighth labor required him to steal the mares of Diomedes, carnivorous horses that fed on human flesh. Heracles tamed them by feeding them their master, Diomedes, and returned them to Eurystheus, who let them go free. The ninth labor was to obtain the girdle of Hippolyta, queen of the Amazons. Initially willing to give it to him, Hippolyta's generosity was thwarted by Hera, who spread rumors that Heracles intended to abduct her. A battle ensued, and Hippolyta was killed. Heracles returned with the girdle, but at the cost of unnecessary bloodshed. The 10th labor brought Heracles to the edge of the known world. He was tasked with stealing the cattle of Geryon, a 3-bodied giant who lived on the island of Erythea. Heracles killed Geryon, stole the cattle, and returned them, despite numerous obstacles placed in his path, including Hera's continued interference. Because 2 of the previous labors, the Hydra and the stables, were disqualified, Eurystheus imposed 2 additional tasks. The 11th labor was to steal the golden apples of the Hesperides, which grew in a garden guarded by a 100-headed dragon and tended by nymphs. On his journey, Heracles encountered Prometheus, still bound to the rock. Heracles freed him by slaying the eagle that tormented him. To retrieve the apples, Heracles convinced Atlas, who held up the sky, to fetch them while Heracles temporarily took his burden. When Atlas returned and tried to trick him into taking the burden permanently, Heracles outwitted him and completed the labor. The 12th and final labor was to capture Cerberus, the 3-headed hound guarding the gates of the underworld. Hades agreed to the task on the condition that Heracles not use weapons. Wrestling Cerberus into submission with his bare hands, Heracles brought the beast to Eurystheus, who, terrified, begged him to return it at once. Through these labors, Heracles became not only the strongest of all mortals, but also a symbol of human endurance. His story resonated because it was not one of effortless glory. Every task required suffering, cleverness, and resilience. He was both hero and outcast, both divine and deeply flawed. His strength was matched by his pain. After completing the labors, Heracles' life continued to be marked by conflict and tragedy. He fought in battles, married multiple women, and fathered numerous children. One of the most heartbreaking episodes came near the end of his life. His wife, Deianira, unknowingly gave him a poisoned tunic, believing it to be a love charm. The tunic, soaked in the Hydra's blood, burned his flesh. In agony, Heracles built his own funeral pyre atop Mount Oeta. As the flames consumed him, Zeus intervened. Heracles' mortal body perished, but his divine spirit ascended to Olympus. There, he was reconciled with Hera and granted immortality. He married Hebe, the goddess of youth, and found peace among the gods. His transformation from a suffering mortal to an eternal deity marked the completion of his mythic arc. Heracles became a model of heroic suffering and redemption. His labors symbolized the hardships of life and the possibility of overcoming them. He bridged the worlds of man and God, not by birth alone, but by enduring trials that transcended human limits. In temples and myths, in art and literature, Heracles was celebrated not only for what he conquered, but for what he endured. His story would become a cornerstone of Greek cultural identity, a reminder that greatness often comes through struggle, and that even the strongest among us are shaped by pain. As the heroic age in Greek mythology reached its peak, a single conflict brought together nearly all its greatest figures, mortal and divine. The Trojan War, perhaps the most famous story in all of ancient Greek literature, did not begin with armies or conquest. It began with a wedding, a golden apple, and a beauty contest among goddesses. The roots of this decade-long war stretch back to divine vanity, mortal temptation, and a chain of choices that slowly, inevitably, pulled the world toward catastrophe. The mythological origin of the Trojan War begins with the marriage of Peleus, a mortal hero, and Thetis, a sea nymph. Their union was arranged by Zeus, who had once desired Thetis himself, but abandoned the pursuit after a prophecy warned that her child would surpass his father. Rather than risk being overthrown, Zeus arranged her marriage to Peleus, a noble but mortal man. Their wedding, held on Mount Pelion, was attended by gods and heroes alike. However, one figure was not invited: Eris, the goddess of strife and discord. Angered by her exclusion, Eris arrived uninvited and threw a golden apple into the gathering. Upon the apple were inscribed the words, "To the fairest." This simple gesture ignited a dispute among three powerful goddesses, Hera, Athena, and Aphrodite, each of whom claimed the apple as her rightful prize. Unable to settle the argument themselves, the goddesses turned to Zeus, who wisely refused to judge. Instead, he appointed Paris, a Trojan prince, to determine which of the three was most beautiful. Paris was the son of King Priam and Queen Hecuba of Troy. At his birth, an ominous prophecy had declared that he would bring ruin to his city. In response, his parents had him exposed on a mountainside, but he survived and was raised by shepherds, unaware of his royal lineage. When the goddesses appeared before Paris on Mount Ida, each sought to influence his decision with promises. Hera offered political power and dominion over all of Asia. Athena offered wisdom and unmatched military prowess. Aphrodite, however, promised him the love of the most beautiful mortal woman in the world. Paris awarded the golden apple to Aphrodite, sealing his fate and the fate of his city. The woman Aphrodite had promised was Helen, the daughter of Zeus and Leda. Her beauty was said to rival that of the goddesses themselves. At the time, Helen was already married to Menelaus, the king of Sparta. When Paris traveled to Sparta under the guise of diplomacy, he met Helen and, with Aphrodite's influence, either seduced or abducted her. The nature of her departure varies across different versions of the myth. Some portray Helen as complicit, while others cast her as a victim. Regardless, Paris brought her to Troy, igniting a fury that would burn for years. Menelaus returned to find his wife gone and his honor shattered. He appealed to his brother Agamemnon, the powerful king of Mycenae, to help retrieve Helen and punish the Trojans. Agamemnon saw an opportunity for personal glory and influence and agreed to lead an expedition. Together, they summoned the kings and warriors of Greece who had once sworn an oath to defend Helen's marriage, an oath crafted by Odysseus during Helen's original courtship. Among those called to arms were many of the era's most renowned heroes. Odysseus, known for his cunning mind, Achilles, the unmatched warrior and son of the sea nymph Thetis. Ajax the Greater, a towering and brave fighter. Diomedes, bold and relentless in battle. And Nestor, the wise old king of Pylos. Some came out of duty, others for honor, and some for the promise of plunder or fame. Achilles, in particular, was a reluctant participant, aware of a prophecy that said he would either live a long, quiet life or die young in glory at Troy. His mother Thetis tried to hide him by disguising him as a girl on the island of Scyros. Odysseus, however, uncovered the deception by laying out weapons among feminine gifts and watching which items the disguised Achilles chose. When Achilles instinctively reached for a sword, his identity was revealed. With the coalition assembled, the Greek fleet prepared to set sail for Troy. But even before the war began, divine tensions stirred. The goddess Artemis, angered by Agamemnon for either offending her or killing a sacred animal, sent unfavorable winds that trapped the fleet at Aulis. To appease her, the seer Calchas declared that Agamemnon must sacrifice his daughter Iphigenia. After much hesitation, Agamemnon agreed. This act would haunt him and his family long after the war ended. With Artemis satisfied, the winds shifted, and the Greeks set sail across the Aegean Sea. Upon arriving near Troy, they landed on the coast and began preparations for a long siege. The city of Troy, ruled by Priam and defended by his many sons, including the noble Hector and the reckless Paris, was well fortified and strategically positioned. Its walls, said to be built by the gods themselves, seemed impenetrable. As the war unfolded, divine allegiances emerged. The gods did not remain neutral. Hera and Athena, furious at Paris for choosing Aphrodite, supported the Greeks. Poseidon also favored the Greek cause, while Aphrodite, Apollo, and Ares took the side of the Trojans. Zeus, though the king of the gods, remained largely aloof, attempting to maintain a divine balance while events played out below. The early years of the Trojan War were marked by smaller battles, shifting alliances, and individual duels rather than large-scale conflict. Greek heroes sought to establish reputations through personal valor. Raids on Trojan allies and surrounding cities provided supplies and disrupted the region, but failed to breach Troy's walls. Tensions among the Greeks themselves also emerged. Agamemnon's arrogance and Achilles' pride clashed repeatedly, laying the groundwork for internal strife that would eventually weaken their unity. The seeds of tragedy had already been sown, even before the full weight of the war was felt. The origins of the Trojan War reveal much about the Greek worldview. The conflict was not driven solely by politics or ambition, but by divine influence, personal vows, and a deep sense of honor. Helen, whether seen as a willing lover or an innocent victim, became the face of a war that was as much about reputation and destiny as it was about territory. The judgment of Paris is a myth within a myth, a moment that illustrates how small decisions, driven by vanity or desire, can shape the course of history. The gods were not distant beings watching from above. They were deeply enmeshed in human affairs, their rivalries and passions reflected in mortal suffering. As the Greeks settled into their long siege and the Trojans prepared for a defense that would last for years, the stage was set for one of the most enduring and powerful epics in Western tradition. The Iliad, attributed to Homer, would later capture a few weeks in the final year of the war, but the story itself spanned over a decade, filled with heartbreak, heroism, and divine wrath. With Helen in Troy and the vast Greek army assembled along the shores, the long siege began. What unfolded over the next 10 years was not a single, continuous battle, but a drawn-out conflict filled with duels, raids, diplomacy, divine interference, and shifting loyalties. The war was as much a contest of will and character as it was of weapons. Within its walls, Troy stood proud and unbroken. Outside, the Greek forces endured years of attrition, driven by both vengeance and glory. Through the lens of this conflict, Greek mythology brought to life some of its most enduring and complex figures. The Trojan War, though most famously narrated in Homer's Iliad, was expanded in various other epics and oral traditions, many of which have been lost. The Iliad itself covers only a brief window in the final year of the war, but even that narrow frame reveals the moral depth, emotional stakes, and tragic grandeur that defined the conflict. At the heart of the Iliad is the quarrel between Agamemnon, the commander of the Greek forces, and Achilles, the Greeks' most formidable warrior. When the Greeks sacked a nearby city allied with Troy, they claimed prizes in the form of war captives. Agamemnon took Chryseis, the daughter of a Trojan priest of Apollo, while Achilles claimed Briseis. When Chryseis' father appealed to Agamemnon to return his daughter and offered a ransom, Agamemnon refused. In response, the priest prayed to Apollo, who sent a plague upon the Greek camp. Under pressure from his own people and the prophet Calchas, Agamemnon relented and returned Chryseis, but only after seizing Briseis from Achilles as compensation. Enraged by this public insult and the loss of his war prize, Achilles withdrew from the fighting. His absence shifted the balance of power in favor of the Trojans. Achilles' withdrawal is not just a personal grudge. It is a meditation on pride, honor, and agency. In Homeric thought, a warrior's status was not defined by abstract morality, but by time, the honor that came from achievements in battle and the recognition of peers. By stripping Achilles of his due reward, Agamemnon had publicly humiliated him, and Achilles responded by stepping back from the communal struggle, even as his comrades perished. With Achilles absent, the Trojans surged forward under the leadership of Hector, Prince of Troy and son of King Priam. Hector is one of the most admirable and human characters in the entire myth. Unlike Achilles, who is driven by rage and personal glory, Hector fights out of duty to his city and family. He is both warrior and protector, deeply aware of the costs of war. In one of the most poignant scenes of the Iliad, he bids farewell to his wife Andromache and their infant son Astyanax, knowing he may never return from battle. The war drew more divine involvement as it progressed. Hera and Athena, still angered by Paris's judgment, continued to support the Greeks. Aphrodite, who had promised Helen to Paris, remained loyal to the Trojans. Apollo also aided Troy, often acting in defense of Hector. Even Zeus, though he tried to maintain neutrality, found himself pulled toward one side or another, depending on circumstance and appeal. With the gods so deeply enmeshed in the struggle, the lines between fate and choice grew ever thinner. Heroes might possess incredible skill and bravery, but a well-aimed arrow from Apollo or a subtle trick by Athena could undo them. In this world, the divine and the mortal coexisted not as separate forces, but as overlapping spheres of influence. One of the war's turning points came with the death of Patroclus, Achilles' closest companion. Unable to watch the Greeks falter without his help, Patroclus borrowed Achilles' armor and entered the battlefield, rallying the Greek forces. Mistaken for Achilles himself, Patroclus drove the Trojans back, but was ultimately killed by Hector. The loss of his friend broke through Achilles' anger and grief, transforming it into a devastating fury. Achilles returned to the battlefield with a vengeance. Donning new armor forged by Hephaestus at the request of his mother Thetis, he became an unstoppable force. His wrath knew no limits. He slaughtered Trojans without mercy, drove them back behind their walls, and finally confronted Hector outside the gates of Troy. Their duel was both inevitable and tragic. Hector, though brave and noble, was no match for Achilles' divine fury. He fell, and Achilles, still consumed by rage, dishonored Hector's body by dragging it behind his chariot around the city. This act of desecration shocked both gods and mortals alike. Yet it was not the end of Hector's story. In one of the Iliad's most powerful and humane moments, King Priam, guided by Hermes, entered the Greek camp at night to beg Achilles for the return of his son's body. Priam's appeal was not political, it was deeply personal. He asked Achilles to remember his own father and to show compassion. Achilles, moved by the old king's grief, relented. He returned Hector's body and granted a temporary truce so that Troy could mourn its fallen hero. This act of reconciliation, brief and fragile, stood as a reminder that even in the midst of brutal war, humanity and empathy could still surface. It also showed Achilles in a new light, not merely as a warrior, but as a man capable of reflection and sorrow. The Iliad ends not with the fall of Troy, but with Hector's funeral, emphasizing that heroism is not defined solely by victory or defeat, but by how individuals face suffering and loss. Yet the war itself was not over. In other traditions, including the Aethiopis, Little Iliad, and Post-Homerica, the story continues. After Hector's death, new warriors emerged to fill the void. The Amazons, led by Queen Penthesilea, joined the Trojans. She fought valiantly before being slain by Achilles, who reportedly fell in love with her beauty even as she died. Soon after, Achilles himself met his end, shot in the heel, his only vulnerable spot, by Paris with the help of Apollo. The prophecy that he would die in glory had been fulfilled. His armor, now vacant, became the object of a new dispute between Ajax and Odysseus. Both had fought bravely and wanted the honor of wearing it. When Odysseus was chosen, Ajax descended into madness and took his own life. This internal strife among the Greeks foreshadowed the darker aspects of victory. Meanwhile, the Greeks devised their final strategy to break the stalemate. But that story, the tale of the wooden horse, the fall of Troy, and the fates of its survivors, belongs to the next chapter in the epic. The Trojan War, as presented in Greek mythology, is not a tale of simple triumph or villainy. It is a reflection of human complexity. Its heroes are flawed, its gods petty, and its consequences devastating. Through its stories, the Greeks explored the costs of pride, the limits of vengeance, and the fragile hope for mercy in a world shaped by fate and fury. After years of relentless warfare, the Greek armies still stood outside the walls of Troy. The cost of the conflict had been enormous, heroes slain, alliances strained, and morale worn thin. Yet the city held firm. The mighty walls of Troy, said to be built by the gods themselves, had resisted every siege and assault. Inside, King Priam clung to hope, even as the city's defenders were exhausted and its greatest warrior, Hector, lay buried. Outside, the Greeks searched for a solution that would end the war once and for all. The final blow would not come from brute strength, but from cunning, a plan conceived by Odysseus that would forever reshape the course of myth. This strategy, known to history and legend alike, was the ruse of the wooden horse. According to tradition, Odysseus proposed building a massive hollow horse, an offering to the goddess Athena that the Greeks would leave behind as a supposed symbol of surrender. Inside the horse, however, would be hidden a select group of Greek warriors. The rest of the army would pretend to abandon the campaign, sailing away to a nearby island and hiding behind the horizon. To the Trojans, it would appear as if the Greeks had finally given up. Epius, a master carpenter and warrior, was tasked with constructing the horse. It was crafted with great care and made large enough to conceal warriors within its belly. Once completed, the Greeks left the horse on the beach and burned their tents, giving the appearance of a genuine withdrawal. They boarded their ships and sailed away, just far enough to vanish from view, but close enough to return swiftly. The Trojans, upon discovering the empty beach and the strange wooden statue, were divided in their response. Some, like the priest Laocoon, warned against accepting the gift. He famously proclaimed, "Beware of Greeks bearing gifts," urging his fellow citizens to destroy the horse. According to legend, as Laocoon stood by the sea, 2 enormous serpents emerged from the water and killed him and his sons. The Trojans interpreted this as a sign of divine disapproval and silenced their doubts. Others, such as the prophetess Cassandra, daughter of Priam and cursed by Apollo to utter true prophecies that no one would believe, also pleaded for caution. But her warnings, as always, went ignored. Finally, persuaded by the apparent Greek retreat and misreading the omens, the Trojans brought the horse into the city. That night, the people of Troy celebrated. They rejoiced in what seemed to be the end of a long and bitter war. The streets filled with music and dancing, fires burned and wine flowed freely. For the first time in many years, the city slept without fear. But as night deepened and the celebrations faded into silence, the Greek fleet returned under the cover of darkness. Inside the horse, the hidden warriors, led by Odysseus, waited for their signal. When the time came, they emerged, opened the gates of the city, and led in the rest of the Greek army. The surprise was total. The Trojans, unarmed and unprepared, were massacred. The sack of Troy was brutal. Temples were looted, palaces burned, and countless civilians slain. Even sacred spaces were violated, drawing divine outrage. King Priam was murdered at the altar of Zeus by Neoptolemus, the son of Achilles, who had already gained a reputation for mercilessness. Queen Hecuba was taken as a slave. Princess Cassandra, dragged from the temple of Athena, was also claimed by Agamemnon, an act that would later lead to his own downfall. Andromache, Hector's widow, was enslaved, and her infant son Astyanax was thrown from the walls of the city, an attempt to prevent any future revenge from the Trojan bloodline. The savagery of the conquest revealed the darkness that had grown in the hearts of the Greek victors, corrupted by years of hardship and vengeance. Amidst the horror, a few Trojans managed to escape. Most notable among them was Aeneas, a distant cousin of King Priam and a hero in his own right. Guided by his mother, the goddess Aphrodite, and carrying his aged father Anchises on his back while holding his young son Ascanius by the hand, Aeneas fled the burning city. His journey, later immortalized in Roman literature through Virgil's Aeneid, would take him across the Mediterranean, eventually leading to the foundations of what would become Rome. In this way, the legacy of Troy lived on beyond its destruction. The Greek victors, though triumphant, would find little peace in the aftermath. Many faced the wrath of the gods for their desecrations during the sack. Ajax the Lesser, who had violated Cassandra in the temple of Athena, was struck down by a storm sent by the goddess herself. Agamemnon returned home to Mycenae only to be murdered by his wife Clytemnestra and her lover Aegisthus, a consequence not only of his sacrifice of Iphigenia, but also of the spoils he brought back from Troy. Menelaus, Helen's husband, managed to recover his wife and return to Sparta, though their reunion was not without tension. Some traditions claimed Helen was never truly in Troy, but instead kept in Egypt by the gods while a phantom stood in her place. Other accounts explored the complicated emotions of their reunion, love, betrayal, and the heavy cost of pride. Odysseus, who had masterminded the horse, suffered perhaps the longest and most arduous return. His journey, recounted in the Odyssey, would take him 10 more years and test every aspect of his resolve, intellect, and loyalty. His return was not merely a voyage across seas, but a transformation from warrior to man, from fame to humility. The fall of Troy marked more than the end of a war. It symbolized the close of the heroic age, a time when gods walked among men and mortals performed deeds of legendary grandeur. In its wake came a world of new concerns, vengeance, justice, and the consequences of unchecked ambition. The war had begun with a stolen bride and a divine grudge, but it ended with cities in ruins, families shattered, and civilizations altered. In artistic and literary traditions, the fall of Troy became a wellspring of reflection. It was a story that warned of hubris, of trusting in appearances, of the fine line between victory and disgrace. It reminded its audiences that even the greatest city, the proudest king, and the strongest warrior could fall, not only by sword, but by deception, pride, and divine will. It also introduced the idea that heroism was no guarantee of reward. Many of the most valiant Greek fighters met inglorious ends. Even those who survived often returned to find betrayal, suffering, or obscurity. The war may have elevated them in legend, but it did not shield them from the grim consequences of their choices. In the ashes of Troy, a new world emerged, one no longer dominated by the towering figures of myth, but by the gradual rise of mortal civilizations, cities, and stories grounded more in the human than the divine. While the flames of Troy faded into myth and its survivors scattered across the ancient world, one hero's journey was far from over. Odysseus, king of Ithaca, had played a crucial role in the fall of the city through his cunning and strategic mind. But unlike other Greek leaders who returned home swiftly, if not peacefully, Odysseus would spend the next 10 years wandering across strange lands, encountering supernatural threats, enduring profound loss, and slowly, painfully, finding his way back to what he had left behind. The story of Odysseus is told in Homer's Odyssey, a sprawling epic that explores not conquest or war, but the nature of identity, loyalty, and homecoming. His voyage is not only a physical journey across stormy seas and enchanted islands, but a spiritual trial testing his endurance, wisdom, and character. While the Iliad dealt with the rage of Achilles, the Odyssey explores perseverance, deception, and longing. When Odysseus set sail from Troy, he commanded 12 ships and a loyal crew. His goal was simple: return to Ithaca and reunite with his wife Penelope and his son Telemachus, whom he had left behind as a baby. Yet the gods had other plans. Odysseus had angered Poseidon by blinding his son, the Cyclops Polyphemus, and from that moment, the sea god swore he would delay Odysseus's return and make him suffer. The first major obstacle came in the land of the Cicones. After sacking their city, Odysseus's men lingered too long, and the Cicones rallied reinforcements. The Greeks were driven back with heavy losses. This pattern would repeat throughout the journey, moments of success undone by hubris or disobedience. Next, the fleet reached the land of the Lotus Eaters, a peaceful people who consumed the narcotic lotus flower. When some of Odysseus's men ate the plant, they forgot their homes and desired only to remain in a haze of forgetfulness. Odysseus had to drag them back to the ships by force, reminding them of their mission. This episode, though brief, encapsulates one of the epic's central themes: the seductive power of forgetfulness and the struggle to remember one's purpose. Far more dangerous was the encounter with Polyphemus, the Cyclops. Trapped in the giant's cave, Odysseus devised a clever plan. He told the Cyclops his name was Nobody, gave him strong wine, and once the monster slept, blinded him with a sharpened stake. When Polyphemus cried out in pain, his neighbors ignored him. After all, Nobody was hurting him. As the Greeks escaped by clinging to the undersides of the Cyclops' sheep, Odysseus could not resist revealing his true name, shouting it back in pride. That act of ego cost him dearly, as Polyphemus prayed to his father, Poseidon, to curse Odysseus's journey. From there, the fleet sailed to the island of Aeolus, keeper of the winds. Aeolus gifted Odysseus a bag containing all the winds, except the west wind needed to carry them home. But as Ithaca came into view, Odysseus's crew, thinking the bag held treasure, opened it. The winds escaped, and the ships were blown far off course. Once again, success slipped away due to human folly. Further trials awaited. On the land of the Laestrygonians, a race of cannibalistic giants, Odysseus lost all but one ship. The giants destroyed the fleet, devouring many of the crew. The survivors fled to the island of Aiaia, home of the sorceress Circe. There, Odysseus's men were transformed into animals, pigs in most versions. With the help of the god Hermes, who provided a magical herb, Odysseus resisted Circe's spells and convinced her to restore his men. He remained with her for a year, eventually persuading her to let him continue his journey. Before leaving, Circe warned him of further dangers and instructed him to descend into the underworld to consult the prophet Tiresias. This descent into the realm of the dead marks one of the most powerful episodes of the Odyssey. In the underworld, Odysseus encountered the spirits of the fallen, his mother, soldiers from Troy, and the shade of Achilles, who famously declared that he would rather be a living servant than a dead king. These encounters deepened Odysseus's understanding of mortality and the cost of glory. Returning to the world of the living, Odysseus faced the sirens, creatures whose songs lured sailors to their deaths. To hear them without succumbing, he had his crew plug their ears with wax while he himself was tied to the mast, commanding his men not to release him no matter how he begged. This moment is emblematic of the Greek ideal of resisting temptation through discipline and planning. Next came Scylla and Charybdis, two dangers on either side of a narrow strait. Scylla was a many-headed monster who snatched sailors from ships. Charybdis was a whirlpool that could swallow an entire vessel. Choosing to pass closer to Scylla, Odysseus lost 6 men but avoided total destruction. The lesson was grim but necessary. Sometimes a leader must choose the lesser evil to save the greater part. Finally, the crew reached the island of Thrinacia, sacred to the sun god Helios. Despite clear warnings not to touch the sacred cattle, Odysseus's men, driven by hunger, slaughtered them. In retribution, Zeus destroyed their ship with a lightning bolt. Only Odysseus survived, clinging to wreckage until he drifted to the island of Ogygia. There, he was held by the nymph Calypso for 7 years. She offered him immortality and comfort, but Odysseus longed only for home. Eventually, the gods intervened. Hermes arrived with a message from Zeus, and Calypso reluctantly let him go. He built a raft and set sail, only to be wrecked once more by Poseidon. He washed ashore on the island of the Phaeacians, who finally offered him safe passage to Ithaca. After 20 years away, Odysseus returned to his homeland in disguise. His palace had been overrun by suitors vying for Penelope's hand, believing him dead. His wife, faithful and clever, had delayed them by weaving and unweaving a burial shroud, promising to choose a suitor once it was complete. She remained steadfast, but the pressure from the suitors had become unbearable. With the help of his son Telemachus, who had grown into a man during his absence, Odysseus revealed his identity. In a climactic test, Penelope proposed an impossible task: string Odysseus's bow and shoot an arrow through 12 axe heads. None of the suitors could even bend the bow. Odysseus, still disguised, performed the task effortlessly and then, with Telemachus, killed the suitors in a violent reckoning. Peace was not immediate. The families of the slain suitors demanded justice, and a final confrontation loomed. But Athena intervened, calling for reconciliation. A truce was made, and Odysseus, scarred and wiser, resumed his place as king. The Odyssey is not merely an adventure tale. It is a story about longing, loss, and the enduring power of home. Odysseus's strength lay not only in his sword arm, but in his mind. He survived not because he was the strongest warrior, but because he adapted, endured, and remembered who he was. Unlike other heroes who perished in glory or faded into obscurity, Odysseus returned. His triumph was not conquest, but restoration. He rebuilt his household, reclaimed his identity, and proved that heroism was not always measured on the battlefield. As the last echoes of the heroic age faded and the great figures of myth either ascended, vanished, or died, Greek mythology entered a new phase, one not defined by fresh tales of gods and heroes, but by remembrance, reinterpretation, and legacy. The world of mortals moved forward, but the myths they had lived by did not disappear. Instead, they transformed, transitioning from living belief systems into cultural, literary, and philosophical foundations. In this final chapter of our journey through Greek mythology, we explore how the stories endured, changed, and continued to shape thought long after the last divine intervention had passed into memory. By the time classical Greece emerged in the 6th and 5th centuries before the Common Era, the myths that had once explained the cosmos, justified kingship, and offered models for human behavior were already ancient, but they remained central to Greek life. In the cities of Athens, Corinth, Thebes, and others, mythological figures adorned temples, public spaces, pottery, and theater stages. The names of Zeus, Athena, Apollo, and Dionysus were still invoked, not only in personal devotion, but in public ritual, law, and education. Yet something fundamental had shifted. Philosophers began to question the literal truth of the myths. Thinkers like Xenophanes criticized the portrayal of the gods, pointing out the absurdity of divine beings acting with such human flaws. He argued that if animals had gods, they would imagine them in their own image, just as humans had done. Socrates, famously condemned for impiety, questioned the moral value of the myths told to children, asking whether stories of divine trickery and vengeance truly inspired virtue. Plato went further. In his Republic, he proposed censoring mythological tales that portrayed gods behaving immorally. For Plato, myths were powerful educational tools, but they had to be reformed to reflect philosophical ideals. He introduced the idea of myth as allegory, stories not to be taken literally, but as symbolic narratives pointing toward deeper truths. Yet even as philosophers dissected them, myths retained their hold on the public imagination. They were woven into Greek drama, especially in the tragedies of Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides. These playwrights did not merely retell old stories, they interrogated them, asking what they meant in a changing world. In Agamemnon, Aeschylus portrayed the return of the victorious king from Troy as the beginning of a cursed cycle of blood and revenge. In Medea, Euripides offered a shocking and deeply human portrayal of a mythic sorceress pushed to the edge by betrayal. In Antigone, Sophocles explored the conflict between personal conscience and state authority. In this way, myth became not just tradition, but a means of questioning tradition. The gods and heroes became characters in debates about justice, identity, freedom, and fate. Meanwhile, historians like Herodotus and Thucydides took a different approach. They sought to separate fact from legend. Herodotus often included myths in his accounts, but marked them as stories told by others, not necessarily truth. Thucydides was even more critical, avoiding myths entirely in his political history of the Peloponnesian War. Yet both men understood that myth, whether literally true or not, shaped how people saw the world, and thus had real power. By the Hellenistic period, following the conquests of Alexander the Great, Greek culture spread across Egypt, Persia, and parts of India. The myths traveled too, blending with local traditions. In Egypt, Greek gods were identified with Egyptian deities, Zeus with Amun, Hermes with Thoth. New cults emerged, and mythology adapted to new political and spiritual environments. In Rome, Greek mythology underwent another transformation. The Romans adopted the Greek gods, changing their names and integrating them into their own history. Zeus became Jupiter, Hera became Juno, and Poseidon became Neptune. The poet Virgil, in his Aeneid, reimagined the fall of Troy as the prelude to the founding of Rome, giving his people a divine and heroic ancestry. In doing so, he preserved Greek myth while reshaping it for a new audience. Meanwhile, myth continued to serve religious purposes. Mystery cults, such as those of Demeter and Persephone at Eleusis or of Dionysus, offered initiates sacred rituals and secret knowledge. These cults used myth not just as story, but as experience, promising transformation, rebirth, and a deeper connection to the divine. However, by the early centuries of the Common Era, a new force began to rise: Christianity. With its emphasis on monotheism, scriptural authority, and moral universality, Christianity stood in stark contrast to the polytheistic and often morally ambiguous world of Greek mythology. As the Roman Empire gradually embraced the new faith, pagan temples were closed, and traditional myths were reclassified as falsehoods or even dangerous lies. Yet myth did not vanish. Christian writers and thinkers, even as they condemned the gods of Olympus, drew upon classical learning. The works of Homer, Hesiod, and the tragedians continued to be copied, studied, and admired. Mythological figures became literary symbols. Persephone as a model of death and rebirth, Hercules as a symbol of strength and struggle, Orpheus as a Christ-like figure descending into the underworld. Allegorical readings flourished, and myths were reinterpreted to fit Christian values. During the Renaissance, Greek mythology experienced a full revival. Artists, poets, and philosophers rediscovered the ancient texts and reintroduced mythological themes into European culture. Botticelli painted the birth of Venus. Michelangelo sculpted figures of heroic grandeur. Shakespeare wrote of Troilus and Cressida. In these hands, myth became once again a living language, capable of expressing beauty, tragedy, and the full range of human experience. In the modern world, Greek mythology remains ever present. It lives on in literature, from James Joyce's Ulysses to Rick Riordan's Percy Jackson series. It shapes psychology, especially in the work of Carl Jung and Sigmund Freud, who used mythic archetypes to explore the human mind. It permeates popular culture, from films and video games to architecture and advertising. But beyond all the adaptations and retellings, The myths endure because they speak to something timeless. They ask eternal questions. What is justice? What is fate? How should we live? They present gods who are powerful but flawed, and heroes who strive not for perfection, but for meaning. They reflect the hopes, fears, and complexities of the human condition. In the end, Greek mythology is not just a catalog of ancient stories. It is a mirror. In its shimmering surface, we see the reflection of a civilization searching for order in a chaotic world, trying to understand the mysteries of life and death, greatness and downfall, love and loss. The myths have changed, but they have never died. Like Prometheus's fire, they continue to burn, passed down, reimagined, retold, and through them, the voice of ancient Greece still speaks, inviting each new generation to listen, to wonder, and to ask again, who are we, and what stories will we leave behind?